The phone was wrapped in a plastic grocery bag and taped inside an empty paint can, and I almost didn't pull the lid off. I want to be honest about that first, because it is the detail I keep coming back to whenever I tell this story in my head at 3 a.m, which I still do more often than I'd like to admit. I was standing in my own garage on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of October, looking for a specific gallon of exterior primer I knew we owned because I had bought it myself 2 summers earlier to touch up the trim around the back door, and the shelf where it should have been was crowded with a dozen other paint cans that all looked the same in the dim light. Grey lids, handwritten labels gone soft and illegible with age, and I was working my way down the row, lifting each one to check the weight, because an empty can is lighter than a can with paint still in it, and that is the only reason my hand closed around a can that turned out to have almost nothing inside it at all, except a folded plastic bag and a phone I had never seen in my life. My name is Nathan Reeve. I'm 42 years old, and on that particular Saturday afternoon, standing under the bare bulb of my own garage with a paint can in one hand and a stranger's phone in the other, I had no idea that I was about to spend the next 5 weeks of my life becoming a different kind of man than the one who had walked into that garage a few minutes earlier. A calmer man, a colder man in certain very specific ways, a man who would end up needing every ounce of a discipline I did not know I had until I was forced to find it. I want to walk you through exactly how I found it, because the order of things matters more than people expect. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no reason to be suspicious. I was not looking for anything except a can of primer, and if the shelf had been organised even slightly differently, if that particular can had been 6 inches to the left or 6 inches to the right, I might never have picked it up at all, and I think about that more than I probably should. The specific arbitrary geometry of a garage shelf that ended up rewriting the rest of my life. The can was heavier than an empty can should be, but lighter than a full one, an in-between weight that made me shake it out of simple curiosity before I set it back down, and something inside shifted with a small plastic sound that had nothing to do with dried paint. I pried the lid off with the flathead screwdriver I keep on the workbench for exactly that purpose. The lid resisting the way old paint can lids do, sealed by a decade of dried paint along the rim, and inside, instead of primer, there was a grocery bag from the Kroger on Ferncrest Road, folded down tight, and inside that bag, wrapped again in a second layer of plastic, a black phone, a cheap one, the kind you can buy prepaid at a drugstore for $60 without a contract or a name attached to it. Fully charged, screen dark, waiting. I stood there for a long moment just holding it, and I want to describe honestly what went through my mind in that first minute, because it was not what people assume. My first thought was not my wife. My first thought was that we had been robbed at some point, or that a previous owner of the house had left something behind, some strange, forgotten object from the life the place had before we bought it 11 years ago. Cedar Falls, Ohio is not a town where you expect to find a hidden phone in your own garage, and for about 90 seconds I built an entirely innocent explanation in my head, the same reflex I would learn later that almost everyone builds in that first disoriented minute, because the alternative explanation is one no one wants to reach for first. It was only when I pressed the power button out of simple mechanical curiosity, the same curiosity that makes you check whether an old flashlight still has batteries in it, and the screen woke up on a lock display that did not ask for a passcode, that I understood this was not an old phone. The battery icon read 81%. Someone had charged this phone recently. Someone had held this phone recently. And whoever that was, they had wrapped it in 2 layers of plastic and taped it inside a paint can on a shelf in my garage, in a house where the only 2 adults with regular access to that garage were me and my wife of 16 years, Claire Reeve. I need to back up now, because none of what I found in the weeks that followed would make sense to you without understanding who Claire and I actually were before that Saturday, and I think it's important to say clearly, at the very start of this, that ours was not a marriage that looked broken from the outside, or even from most angles on the inside. I did not go looking in that garage because I suspected anything. I want that understood plainly, because I know how these stories usually get told, some slow unravelling of suspicion building for months until a husband finally goes looking for proof. That is not what happened to me. What happened to me is that I found the proof by accident, with absolutely no warning, on an ordinary Saturday, in the middle of an ordinary October, and only afterward did I go back through the last 14 months of my life and start finding all the places where the truth had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, disguised as something else. Claire and I met 19 years ago, at a mutual friend's wedding reception in Columbus, of all the unoriginal places two Ohio people can meet. And I remember the specific thing that struck me about her before I knew anything else, which was that she was the only person at that reception actually running the room without anyone quite noticing she was doing it, refilling a nervous mother of the bride's wine glass before it was empty, redirecting a drunk uncle away from the microphone with a joke instead of a scolding, making the wedding planner laugh so hard she nearly dropped her clipboard. I thought, watching her do all of that from across a room full of rented folding chairs, there is a woman who makes things work without needing credit for it, and I want to be honest that 19 years later I still believe that observation was accurate. It was simply information I did not yet know how to fully use, because a woman who is extraordinarily good at making things run smoothly behind the scenes is capable of applying that same skill to things far more complicated than a wedding reception, including, as it turned out, an entire second life. We dated 2 years before I proposed, on the walking bridge over Miller Creek at the edge of Cedar Falls' little downtown park, which people find charming until I explain that I proposed there mostly because it was the only quiet spot in town that wasn't also somebody's regular dog-walking route, a detail Claire still brings up, or brought up, when she wants to remind me that I have never once in my life prioritized romance over logistics. We married 16 years ago, this past June, at the same little Methodist church her grandmother had attended her whole life, 90 guests. Her father gave a toast that ran 11 minutes and made exactly one joke that landed. And I remember standing at that altar with the specific, uncomplicated certainty you're allowed to have at 26, absolutely convinced I had solved the entire remaining shape of my life in one afternoon. Ava came 4 years later, Miles 5 years after that, and the 12 years since have been, by any reasonable measure, I would have given you 18 months ago, good years. Not without ordinary friction, we fought about money sometimes, about whose turn it was to handle a sick kid at 2 a.m, about whether we could afford the roof repair this year or needed to push it another year, the completely normal texture of a marriage between two working adults raising 2 kids in a modest house on Bellwood Court. But good years, years I would have described, without a single reservation, as the specific kind of steady, unglamorous happiness I had always assumed was the actual point of building a life with someone, rather than the dramatic kind people write songs about. I work as an operations manager for a regional logistics and warehousing company called Corland Distribution, based about 20 minutes outside Cedar Falls, and I have spent 17 years in a job that has taught me a specific professional discipline I did not fully appreciate the value of until the Saturday I found that phone. When a shipment discrepancy shows up in our inventory system, a pallet count that doesn't match the manifest, you do not walk into the warehouse floor and start accusing people. You pull the data, you cross-reference the loading logs against the driver manifests against the warehouse scan records, and you build a timeline that cannot be argued with, because an accusation built on a hunch gets you nothing but a grievance filed against you and a problem that never actually gets solved. I have built exactly that kind of airtight timeline more times in my career than I could count, for pallets and freight and inventory shrinkage, and standing in my garage that Saturday afternoon with a stranger's phone in my hand, some very quiet, very calm part of me, a part that would end up doing almost all of the important work over the next 5 weeks, was already thinking, in almost those exact words, this is a discrepancy. And the only way to handle a discrepancy is to build the file before you say a single word out loud. I did not turn that phone in for a real search that first day. I want to be honest about the order of things because I think it matters enormously to how the rest of this story unfolded. I stood in that garage for maybe 10 minutes, phone in hand, screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and I made a decision that I have thought about every single day since, which is that I was not going to act on a single piece of information until I understood the entire shape of what I was looking at. I pressed the power button again and let the screen go dark. I wrapped the phone back in its 2 layers of plastic, exactly the way I had found it, folded the grocery bag the same way it had been folded, and set it back inside the paint can, and pressed the lid down along the rim until it sealed with the same faint resistance it had come apart with. I put the can back on the shelf in the exact position I had found it, grey label facing out, second row from the left between a can of white ceiling paint and a can of stain we'd used on the back deck 3 summers ago. I found the actual primer 2 cans further down the row, took it inside, and spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon touching up the trim around the back door exactly the way I had planned to before any of this happened, while my wife made dinner in the kitchen 20 feet away and asked me, at one point, through the open window if I wanted onions in the pasta sauce, and I said yes, and my voice, I am told by the version of myself who's replayed that afternoon more times than is probably healthy, did not shake at all. I want to describe that dinner in some detail, because it is the first of what would become dozens of ordinary family dinners I sat through over the following 5 weeks, with a piece of information sitting in my chest like a stone, watching my wife and my children move through an evening that looked, from every visible angle, exactly like every other evening of our life together. Ava, 13 years old, a competitive swimmer with the specific quiet discipline that distance swimming produces in a certain kind of kid, was telling us about a set of 200 repeats her coach had run the team through that morning, the kind of workout she describes with a grim pride that always makes me laugh because she clearly hates it and loves having survived it in equal measure. Miles, 9 years old, was in the middle of what had been, for about 3 months running, an all-consuming obsession with basketball trading cards, narrating the relative value of a rookie card he'd traded for at recess, with the seriousness of a hedge fund manager discussing a merger. Claire laughed at something Miles said. A real laugh. Unguarded. The kind of laugh I had heard across 16 years of marriage and never once had cause to doubt. And I sat there with a paint can 30 feet away in the garage, thinking, I do not know this woman as well as I believed I did 4 hours ago, and also thinking in the very same breath, there has to be an explanation, because the alternative is a version of my life I am not ready to live inside yet. I did not sleep well that night, lying next to Claire in the dark, listening to her breathing settle into the slow, even rhythm of actual sleep, while my own mind ran through every possible innocent explanation for a hidden, charged, passcode-free phone taped inside a paint can in our garage. Maybe it belonged to her sister, Renee, who had stayed with us for 2 weeks the previous spring while she looked for an apartment after a bad breakup, and who was, by Claire's own fond description, exactly the kind of person who might hide a phone from an ex-boyfriend she was trying to avoid. Maybe it was work-related somehow, a company device for some project Claire hadn't mentioned yet, though I could not immediately construct a version of that explanation that accounted for the hiding, or the paint can, or the second layer of plastic. I built and discarded at least 6 different innocent stories that night, lying perfectly still so I would not wake her, and I noticed, somewhere around 2 in the morning, that every single story I built required more and more effort to sustain, while the simplest explanation, the one I did not want to look at directly, required no effort to believe at all. It simply sat there in the dark waiting for me the same way the phone had been waiting in that paint can, patient, undemanding, entirely unbothered by how badly I wanted it not to be true. I did not go back into the garage the next day or the day after that. I want to explain the reasoning behind that because I know it sounds strange, waiting, when the thing you most want in the world is an answer. But I have built enough inventory audits in my career to know that the worst thing you can do with a single anomalous data point is act on it immediately. Because a single data point tells you almost nothing about the shape of the problem. And I did not want to confront my wife of 16 years, the mother of my children, over a phone I had looked at for perhaps 40 seconds in a dim garage, only to discover it belonged to her sister after all, and spend the rest of our marriage as the man who accused her over a misunderstanding he never bothered to verify. So I waited, 3 full days doing ordinary things, driving Ava to swim practice, helping Miles sort his basketball cards into the plastic sleeves he insisted were essential to their long-term value, sitting across from Claire at dinner every night watching her tell us about her day in the same warm, familiar voice she had used for 16 years, while a separate, much colder part of my mind quietly built a plan for how I was going to find out the truth, without tipping my hand before I understood the whole shape of it. Claire works as the Vice President of Regional Partnerships for Iron Line Fitness, a chain of gyms and wellness clinics with locations across 4 counties, a job she'd held in its current, expanded form for almost exactly 14 months by that point, since a promotion the previous August that we had celebrated with a nice dinner at the steakhouse off Route 9 and a bottle of wine we couldn't really afford, but bought anyway because she had worked hard for that promotion. And I was, and remain, genuinely proud of her professional life in a way that has nothing to do with what I eventually learned. The promotion had come with new responsibilities she had explained at the time, a broader territory, a heavier travel schedule, quarterly partnership summits with vendors and sponsor businesses across the region, evening events that ran later than her old role ever had, and I had absorbed all of that the way you absorb any explanation from a spouse you trust completely, without a second thought, because it was a reasonable account of what her expanded VP role actually required, And because 16 years of trust does not evaporate the instant it is tested, it eroded, I would come to understand slowly, fact by fact. Over 14 months I had lived through without noticing any of it as a pattern at all. On the fourth day, a Tuesday evening, Claire left for what she described as a partnership dinner with a sponsor account in Delridge, the next town over, the kind of evening event that had become, over the preceding year, common enough that I no longer registered it as anything worth a second thought, and I told her to drive safe and I put the kids to bed, and once the house was quiet I went out to the garage, alone, and took the paint can down off the shelf for the second time. This time I did more than glance at the lock screen. I sat down on the old folding chair we keep out there for when I'm working on something that takes a while, phone in my lap, and I spent almost 2 hours going through everything that phone would let me see without a passcode, which turned out to be considerably more than I expected, because whoever had set it up had left the lock screen notification preview turned on, a small, almost accidental oversight that ended up being the single most important piece of carelessness in this entire story. Messages arrived while I sat there, twice, both previewed on the lock screen in full before I could even unlock anything, and both were from a contact saved simply as D. The first read, "Can't stop thinking about Tuesday, count the days till the summit." The second, 20 minutes later, read, "She's the only real thing, I get some weeks, you know that right." I read both messages perhaps a dozen times each, sitting in that cold garage in a folding chair, and I want to describe honestly what happened in my body reading them, because it was not what I expected. I did not feel rage. I felt something closer to a very specific, very total stillness. The kind of stillness I imagine settles over you in the half second after a car accident, before the adrenaline arrives, when your body has understood something has gone catastrophically wrong before your mind has finished processing the details. I did not respond to either message. I did not attempt to unlock the phone further. I turned it face down in my lap and sat there in that cold garage for a long time, maybe 30 minutes, doing nothing at all except breathing. And when I finally moved, I wrapped the phone back exactly as I had found it, sealed the paint can, and set it back on the shelf in its precise original position, and went back inside. And I remember standing in my own kitchen afterward, running the tap and drinking a full glass of water I did not particularly want, simply because the physical act of doing something ordinary felt like the only available way to prove to myself that I was still standing inside my own life. Claire came home around 10 that night, tired, a little flushed from what she described as a longer dinner than expected, the sponsor wanting to walk through next quarter's marketing calendar in more detail than planned, and she kissed me on the cheek on her way to change out of her work clothes, and I said something forgettable in response, and I want you to understand that I did not confront her that night, or that week, or even that month, because the decision I had made in that garage, the decision that would define everything that followed, was that I was not going to let a stranger's phone and 40 seconds of a preview screen destroy 16 years of my life, without first understanding the complete, verified shape of what I was actually dealing with. I need to tell you about the friend I called first, because I did not do any of what followed entirely alone, even though I made the initial decision to investigate alone. His name is Paul Ostrander, and he has been my closest friend since we were assigned to the same cubicle row at Call and Distribution 14 years ago, back when we were both mid-level coordinators instead of the operations managers we've both become since, and he also happens to live 4 houses down from us on Bellwood Court, which meant that when I called him 2 days after the messages, at 9 at night, and asked if I could come sit on his back porch for a while, he did not ask a single question before saying, "Yes, come on over, I'll leave the light on." Paul is not a man of many words under most circumstances, which is precisely why I trusted him with this before I trusted almost anyone else. I sat on his porch and told him everything. The paint can, the messages, the 14 months of a promotion. I now understood differently than I had understood it 3 days earlier. And Paul listened the entire way through without interrupting once, the way I imagine a good bartender learns to listen. And when I finished he was quiet for a long moment, turning a beer bottle slowly on the armrest of his chair and said, "Nathan, I'm not going to tell you what to do because I don't think anybody gets to tell another man that, but I've watched you run an audit on a warehouse discrepancy that turned out to be one forklift driver skimming pallets for 8 months, and it took you 6 weeks of quiet paperwork to build a case that got him fired with 0 grounds for a lawsuit. You already know how to do this. You're just scared to do it to your own life instead of a warehouse." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of that week, and I think it's the single piece of advice that shaped everything I did afterward. Because Paul was right in a way I hadn't quite let myself see yet. I did already know how to do this. I had simply never imagined I would need to. The following morning, a Saturday, with Claire taking the kids to Ava's swim meet 2 towns over, an event I had begged off of using a work deadline as my excuse, the first outright lie I told in this entire ordeal, though it would be far from the last thing I chose not to say out loud before I was ready. I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and began building what I came to think of, in the language of my own profession, as an audit file. I pulled 18 months of statements from our joint checking account, the account that handled the mortgage and the utilities and the grocery runs, because Claire and I had always kept a small amount of individual discretionary spending on separate cards but ran almost everything else through the joint account. A detail of our finances that had never mattered to either of us until it became the exact thread I needed to pull. I built a spreadsheet, the same structure I use at work for a shrinkage investigation, dates down one column, her stated explanation in the next, whatever hard evidence I could independently verify in a third, and I spent that entire Saturday morning working backward, month by month, looking for anything that didn't fit the story I already had. It took almost 3 hours before I found the first thread, a recurring charge, $11.40, appearing roughly every 5 or 6 weeks for the better part of a year, from a merchant listed simply as FRG Performance LLC, small enough that I had genuinely never noticed it before, buried as it was among grocery charges and Miles's orthodontist copays and the recurring charge for Ava's swim club dues. I did not recognise the merchant name at first, and it took a separate search, typing the exact string into my phone while Claire's car was still presumably parked at a swim meet 40 minutes away, to learn that FRG Performance LLC was the parent billing entity for a business called Forge Performance, a personal training and sports conditioning studio on the east side of Cedar Falls that I vaguely recalled Claire mentioning months earlier as a wellness partner Ironline had brought on for a co-branded fitness challenge promotion. I want to be honest that even finding that thread did not immediately register, in my mind, as proof of anything specific. $11.40, 6 or 7 times over the better part of a year, was too small an amount to be a membership fee or a training package, and for almost 20 minutes I sat at that kitchen table, constructing an entirely mundane explanation, some small co-branded promotional item, a protein bar sample pack, a discounted smoothie charge from a partnership kiosk, the kind of thing a marketing VP might reasonably expense to a joint account by mistake instead of her corporate card. It was only when I cross-referenced the specific dates of those charges against my reconstructed calendar of Claire's evening work events over the preceding year that the shape of something larger started to assemble itself, because every single one of those small charges landed on a day, or the day immediately following a day, that Claire had described to me as a partnership dinner, a sponsor summit, or an evening event running late. I spent that entire week, in the hour or so after Claire went to bed most nights, a fact of our marriage that had never mattered until it became the exact window I needed, pulling 26 months of statements instead of 18, because once I found one pattern, I wanted to know precisely when it had started, and the answer, once I laid it all out, was considerably more precise than I expected. The very first small charge from Forge Performance's billing entity appeared in early August of the previous year, the same month Claire's promotion to Vice President of Regional Partnerships had been announced at Ironline, the same month we'd celebrated at the steakhouse off Route 9. Whatever this was, it had begun almost exactly 14 months before I found that phone in the garage, and it had continued, with what my spreadsheet now showed me was remarkable, almost clockwork consistency, every 5 to 7 weeks since, 12 separate small charges in total, each one landing on the tail end of an evening Claire had described to me using some version of the word summit, or partnership, or sponsor. I called Paul again that Saturday night, and read him the whole spreadsheet over the phone, and he was quiet for a moment before saying the thing that finally gave the man in those 2 lock screen messages an actual shape in my mind instead of just an initial. "Nathan," he said, "doesn't Ironline run that co-branded challenge thing with a personal trainer, some guy who does the corporate wellness pitches? I think Claire mentioned him once at that barbecue 2 summers ago, some fitness studio owner. I want to say his name was Derek." I sat with that name for a long moment, Derek, turning it over, feeling the specific cold click of a puzzle piece sliding into a slot it had clearly been cut for, because I did, now that Paul said it, remember a conversation from roughly a year and a half earlier Claire mentioning a sponsor partnership she was excited about, a personal training studio called Forge Performance, run by a man named Derek Salis, sharp, good at the marketing side of the fitness business, a little full of himself in the specific way successful small business owners in their late 30s sometimes are. And I remembered finding the description completely unremarkable at the time, the kind of mildly amused, mildly professional assessment a spouse makes about a work partner constantly. I had not thought about that conversation again in 18 months, until Paul said the name Derek out loud on a Saturday night phone call, and the entire shape of what I was looking at rearranged itself in front of me. I did not yet know, at that point, whether Derek Salis was the man behind the initial D on that hidden phone, or simply a name attached to a timeline that might still theoretically mean nothing at all. I want to stress that I held on to that theoretical possibility longer than probably made sense, because a warehouse audit does not conclude a driver is skimming pallets just because his schedule correlates with a shrinkage pattern. You verify independently before you act, and some very stubborn part of me needed one more piece of hard, undeniable evidence before I let myself believe what every other part of me already suspected completely. So in the second week of what I was now privately calling, in the same clinical language I use at work, my investigation, I made the decision to bring in someone whose entire profession was verifying exactly this kind of thing without the emotional interference I knew I could not fully strip out of my own judgment, no matter how carefully I tried. I found Denise Falk the way anyone finds anyone these days, a search, a short list of licensed investigators within an hour of Cedar Falls, a handful of reviews that used words like discreet and thorough rather than anything flashier, and a phone call where I said considerably less than I expected to, and she asked more precise, more patient questions than I expected in return. She ran a small private investigation practice out of a converted house near the county courthouse in Delridge, and she had spent 16 years as a detective with the county sheriff's office before going private, and the first thing she told me, sitting across from her in an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet, has stayed with me since. "Mr. Reeve," she said, "most men who sit in that chair already know the answer before they hire me. What you're actually paying for isn't information, it's a version of the truth solid enough to survive someone else arguing with it later, a lawyer, a judge, your own conscience at 3 a.m. wondering if you overreacted. I want you to sit with that for a second, because once I start building a file, I don't stop halfway through to spare anyone's feelings, including yours." I told her I understood, and I told her everything. The paint can, the phone, the 2 messages signed simply D, the recurring charges from Forge Performance stretching back 14 months, the name Derek Salis. Denise wrote almost none of it down while I talked, which unsettled me until she explained that she preferred to listen first and build her own independent file rather than work backward from a husband's theory, because spouses, in her considerable experience, are excellent at noticing patterns and often wrong about exactly what those patterns mean, and she did not want her investigation contaminated by my suspicion before she had verified a single fact on her own. She asked for 3 things before she would take the case: a recent photograph of Claire, a description of Claire's vehicle and license plate, a grey Subaru Outback we had bought 2 years earlier, a detail whose timing I only registered as possibly significant much later, lying awake at 2 a.m. running the math again the way I had taken to doing most nights by then, and Claire's typical schedule on the days she described as partnership dinners or sponsor summits, as best I understood it, when she usually left, what she said she was doing when she typically came home. I gave her all of it, and I remember driving home from that first meeting with a strange hollow calm settling into my chest, the specific calm of a man who has just handed an unbearable problem to someone more qualified than he is to carry it, mixed with a dread that has no comparison I can offer you, because I understood, driving home on Route 9 past the same gas station and the same billboard for a personal injury attorney I had passed 1,000 times without noticing it, that whatever Denise Falk found was going to be true in a way a spreadsheet full of small recurring charges, however damning, had still allowed me to hold at arm's length as a theory rather than a verdict. Denise's first report came back after 12 days, following 2 separate evenings of surveillance, and I want to describe what it felt like to read it, because nothing prepares you for encountering your own marriage described in the flat. Procedural language of a professional investigator. Subject departed residence at 17:38 hours, the report read. Subject drove directly to Iron Line Fitness corporate office on Route 14, consistent with stated departure point. Subject departed corporate office 1902 hours. Subject drove to Forge Performance, 440 Danvers Road, Cedar Falls, arrived 1924 hours, parked in rear lot, entered through side entrance using a keypad code rather than the front customer entrance. Subject's vehicle remained parked in rear lot. At 2011 hours, interior lights in the second floor office above the training studio floor dimmed, consistent with a single lamp remaining on rather than full lighting. Subject's vehicle departed rear lot at 22:07 hours. Subject arrived at residence 23:06 hours, consistent with a claimed evening event running approximately 3.5 hours. I read that paragraph more times than I could count, sitting alone in my truck in the Corland distribution parking lot during my lunch break because I did not trust myself to read it anywhere near Claire or the kids, and I did not trust my own face to walk back into a meeting immediately afterward either. There is something about seeing your own suspicion confirmed in someone else's careful, unemotional handwriting that lands entirely differently than confirming it yourself. And I want to be honest that even after everything I had already found on my own, the spreadsheet, the messages, the recurring charges, I still was not fully prepared for the specific, clinical weight of a stranger's report describing my wife entering a building through a side door with a keypad code, rather than the front entrance any actual client would use. Denise's second report from the following week confirmed the pattern, rather than adding anything dramatically new, the same building, the same side entrance, the same second floor light dimming to a single lamp. And by then I had also asked her whether it was worth attempting to independently verify who else was inside that building during those hours, and she told me, carefully, that public property records showed Forge Performance's second floor was leased separately from the training studio below it as a small private office suite, registered to Derek Salis personally rather than to the LLC, a detail that struck both of us as significant, precisely because it explained why a personal training studio would need a private upstairs office with a lamp and, presumably very little else, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I did not confront Claire during any of this. I want to stress how genuinely difficult that was, because there were nights during that stretch when I sat across from her at our own dinner table, watching her laugh at something Miles said about a rookie basketball card, or listening to her ask Ava thoughtful, specific follow-up questions about her swim times, and some very raw, unguarded part of me wanted nothing more than to put the spreadsheet down in front of her, right there between the pasta and the garlic bread, and simply ask her to explain it to me. I did not do that. And the reason I did not do that is the same reason I had given Paul on his porch weeks earlier. I had already learned, over 17 years of workplace investigations, exactly what happens when you confront someone with a partial case. They deny what you can't yet prove. They explain away what you can prove with just enough plausibility to create doubt, and you are left worse off than before you said anything, holding a weaker position than the one you actually had. I was not going to let that happen with the most important relationship of my life. Whatever I eventually said to Claire, I was going to say at once, completely, with a file so thorough that denial would not be a mathematically available option. The next piece of the file came from something far less dramatic than a surveillance report, and in some ways it disturbed me more than anything Denise had found so far. It came from our family iPad, the one that lived in a charging dock on the kitchen counter, and that all four of us used interchangeably: recipes, school schedules, weekend movies for Miles, homework research for Ava. I was searching it one evening for a permission slip Ava needed reprinted for an away swim meet, and I noticed an app tucked into a folder labelled Utilities that none of us had ever specifically organised, a plain grey icon labelled simply Vault Notes. Not the built-in Notes app I already knew was on there, a different one downloaded. I checked later in the purchase history 16 months earlier, which put it almost exactly at the start of the pattern I had already built out on my spreadsheet. It required a passcode I did not have, and I did not attempt to guess it or force my way past the lock screen, both because I doubted I would succeed, and because I understood, even in that moment standing in my own kitchen at 9 at night, that whatever was behind that passcode needed to surface through a process that would hold up later, not through me fumbling at a login screen like a man breaking into his own family's devices in the dark. I mentioned it to Denise at our next meeting, and she told me, without much surprise in her voice, that a second messaging app disguised under a utility name was about as common in her line of work as the hidden phone itself, and that if there was anything meaningful behind that passcode, it would very likely surface eventually through channels that did not require either of us doing anything legally questionable to force it open. I want to describe one more piece of the file before I move forward, because it came from a source I did not expect at all, and because I think it illustrates something important about how thoroughly Denise approached even the smallest available thread. During her second week of work on the case, she asked me, almost as an afterthought, whether our home router logged any device history, the kind of unglamorous household technology detail most people never think twice about, and I told her I honestly didn't know, and she walked me through, over the phone, how to check the administrative panel of the router in our own basement utility closet, a piece of equipment I had installed myself 3 years earlier and had not thought about since except when the internet occasionally dropped during a storm. What that router log showed me, going back as far as its limited memory retained, roughly 4 months of history, was a separate, unfamiliar tablet device that had connected to our home network on 11 distinct evenings, always for a short window, always between 8 and 11 at night. Always on evenings, Claire had told me she was working late at the office rather than at home. I sat with that discovery for a long time, because it meant, for at least part of the 14 months, and possibly considerably more given the router's limited memory, whatever she had been doing had not always required leaving the house at all, that some portion of this had happened in rooms of our own home while I was elsewhere, at Miles's basketball practice, running errands, asleep upstairs while she told me she was catching up on emails downstairs. I brought this specific piece of the file to Denise, and she cross-referenced the device's connection timestamps against my own reconstructed calendar of evenings I had been out of the house, and every single one of the 11 connections lined up precisely with an evening I was not home. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the more unsettling pieces of the entire investigation, not because it revealed anything Denise's surveillance hadn't already established in broader terms, but because it meant the deception had, at times, occupied the same physical rooms my children slept in. A detail I have never been able to fully separate from everything else I learned in those 5 weeks, and one I chose deliberately not to raise directly with Claire during the confrontation itself, because by that point I had already decided the file was complete enough, and I did not want to spend our final conversation chasing every last unnecessary detail rather than the ones that actually mattered to the outcome. I need to go back now and tell you more about what Claire and I actually were before any of this, because I think it would be easy, hearing only the last 14 months, to assume ours had always been a marriage running on fumes, quietly asking for exactly this kind of ending. It was not that. I've already told you about the wedding, the 16 years, the ordinary good texture of raising Ava and Miles on Bellwood Court, but I want to tell you about one specific memory that I returned to more than any other during those 5 weeks of quiet investigation, because it is the memory that made the whole thing feel less like an ending and more like a kind of grief for something I had believed was permanent. About 3 years before any of this started, I'd come home from a brutal stretch at Corland, a warehouse fire at one of our regional partner sites that had eaten 6 consecutive 16-hour days of my life, sorting out insurance claims and inventory losses, and I remember walking in the back door at nearly midnight on the 6th night, completely wrung out, expecting an empty dark kitchen, and finding Claire still up, sitting at the table with 2 mugs of decaf and a legal pad, having stayed awake specifically to help me talk through the numbers one more time before the insurance adjuster's morning deadline. We sat there until almost 2 in the morning, and at some point, exhausted, I said something self-pitying about feeling like all I ever brought home anymore was warehouse problems, and she reached across the table, took my hand and said, "Nathan, you know that's not true, and even if it were, I married the guy who stays up until 2 in the morning making sure the numbers are right instead of the guy who'd rather just guess and hope. That's not a burden, that's exactly who you are, and I need people like you in my life more than I need an easier version of you." I thought about that conversation more than any other single memory during those 5 weeks, turning it over and over at 2 in the morning the way she had once turned it over with me, because the woman who said that to me, who seemed to mean every word of it, was the same woman whose bank statements were now showing me a pattern of deception stretching back 14 months, and I could not, no matter how many nights I tried, make those 2 versions of her sit comfortably next to each other in the same person. I've come to understand since that they do not have to sit comfortably together to both be genuinely true. People contain contradictions large enough to swallow a marriage whole, and I don't believe Claire was lying to me at that kitchen table 3 years ago. I believe she meant every word of it, and was at some later point capable of an entirely separate deception, running on a completely different track. And I don't fully understand how a person holds both of those things at once, inside a single life, except that apparently they can, and do, more often than any of us like to believe before it happens directly to us. It was during the 4th week that I learned, indirectly and entirely by accident, that I was not the only person who had been carrying a piece of this. Claire's closest friend since college, a woman named Trish Whitmore, came over on a Thursday afternoon while Claire was still at work, ostensibly to drop off a casserole dish she'd borrowed, and I happened to be home early that day for a dentist appointment. And something in the way Trish would not quite meet my eyes when I answered the door, something too careful and too bright in the way she asked how everyone was doing, sat wrong with me in a way I could not immediately name. I did not confront her, because I had learned by then exactly how much damage a premature confrontation could do to a case that wasn't finished yet, but I watched her carefully while she stood in our kitchen for those few minutes, and I noticed her eyes moving toward the calendar on our refrigerator, the one where Claire wrote down evening events in her efficient slanted handwriting, and lingering there a half-second longer than casual glancing requires, and I understood, with a cold certainty I did not enjoy having, that whatever Trish Whitmore knew, she had known it for a while, and had decided, for reasons of her own loyalty to her friend, not to say a single word to me. I did not tell Denise about Trish immediately, because I wanted to think carefully about what it meant, and what I eventually decided it meant was this. If Claire's closest friend knew enough to avoid my eyes over a borrowed casserole dish, then this was not a single reckless mistake, a one-time lapse Claire had perhaps been quietly trying to end on her own. This was something she had built a support structure around, confided in someone, normalized within at least one relationship outside our marriage, and that detail, more than almost anything else in the entire file, was the one that finally moved something inside me from a raw, wounded shock into the specific, focused calm that would carry me through the final 2 weeks of the investigation and the confrontation that followed. I was not grieving a single betrayal anymore. I was grieving an entire architecture, quietly constructed around my own life, one room at a time, over 14 months, with at least one other person holding a key. It was around this same point, in the middle of the 4th week, that I made the decision to consult a divorce attorney, not because I had fully decided to end my marriage. I want to be honest that I had not yet reached that specific certainty even then, but because I understood from 17 years of professional discipline that I needed to know exactly what my legal position was before I did anything else. The same way you consult legal counsel before you terminate an employee for cause, so that whatever emotional decision I eventually made would be made with full knowledge of the practical consequences attached to it. I met with a woman named Miriam Katz, a family law attorney with an office above a bakery on Cedar Falls Main Street, recommended to me by a co-worker who had gone through his own divorce 2 years earlier, and described her, simply, as the person you want in your corner if you want this done cleanly and completely. Miriam listened to the entire outline of what I had built, the paint can, the phone, the messages, the recurring charges, Denise's surveillance reports, the disguised app on the family iPad, and when I finished she sat back in her chair and said something that reframed the entire remaining shape of my investigation. "Mr. Reeve," she said, "in Ohio, infidelity itself doesn't typically move the needle much on how assets get divided in a straightforward divorce. This state doesn't really operate that way in most cases. But you've described something considerably more specific than a straightforward affair, and I want you to hear this clearly. If those hotel and studio expenses or any comparable spending tied to this relationship were paid for using funds that can be traced to marital assets, your joint account, home equity, anything jointly held, that's not just a betrayal, that's dissipation of marital assets, and Ohio courts absolutely do take that into account when dividing property. I want you to keep building exactly the kind of file you've already started, because if what you're describing is what I think it is, you may be entitled to have those specific dissipated funds credited back to you in the final settlement, dollar for dollar, on top of an otherwise standard division of property. That single sentence changed the entire tenor of the final 2 weeks of my investigation, because it meant the spreadsheet I had already built for emotional clarity was also, without my having planned it that way, becoming a legal instrument. Miriam also told me something I had not fully considered on my own, which was that whatever confrontation I eventually had with Claire needed to happen in a way that preserved my ability to gather any final pieces of evidence beforehand, and ideally in a setting where I retained some control over the circumstances, rather than a spontaneous blow-up in the kitchen that would give Claire the chance to destroy or alter anything before a formal separation began. Go home, she told me. Keep living exactly the life you've been living for the last 4 weeks. And when you're ready, pick the moment and the setting yourself. Don't let this decide itself for you in a moment of exhaustion. I want to tell you about the specific moment that finally gave me the last piece of hard evidence I needed, because it came from an entirely unexpected direction, roughly 10 days before I confronted Claire. Denise called me on a Wednesday afternoon and told me that in the course of standard due diligence, checking public business filings related to Forge Performance LLC, she had come across a small claims filing from 18 months earlier, before any of what I'd found had even begun. A dispute between Derek Salis and a former business partner over studio equipment financing. And buried in the exhibits attached to that public filing was an old business email address for Derek that predated his current one. An email address that, when Denise ran it through a basic public records and data breach search, turned up as an associated recovery email on an account tied to the same Vault Notes app installed on our family iPad. It was not proof of content, she was careful to tell me. It did not show me a single message, but it was independent, verifiable, publicly sourced confirmation that the disguised app on my own family's device was connected, through Derek Salis's own digital footprint directly back to him, closing the last remaining gap in a case that had, until that point, been built entirely on timing, financial patterns, and 2 lock screen previews I had seen with my own eyes but could not independently prove came from him specifically. I sat with that confirmation for a full day before I decided anything else. I want to describe what those 10 days felt like, waiting, because they were, without question, the hardest stretch of the entire 5 weeks, harder even than the confrontation itself, because by then I had stopped hoping for an innocent explanation entirely, and what remained was simply the logistics of how and when to end something I now understood, with complete certainty was already over. I decided, with Miriam's guidance, that I wanted the confrontation to happen on a specific date, one I could control completely, and the date I chose was our 16th wedding anniversary, 3 Fridays from that Wednesday phone call. I want to explain why I chose that date, because I know it will strike some listeners as needlessly cruel, and I have turned that judgment over in my own mind more than once since. I chose it because Claire and I had a tradition, every anniversary, of a quiet dinner at home after the kids were at a sleepover, just the 2 of us. Candles, a bottle of wine, no interruptions, and I wanted, for the very last time, complete guaranteed privacy and complete guaranteed time, without a swim meet or a basketball card trade or a work call interrupting the one conversation in my life. I needed to get exactly right. It was not a decision made to inflict maximum pain on a symbolic date. It was a decision made in the end the same way I make every other important decision in my life, by looking for the setting that gave me the best possible conditions to do something difficult correctly. I arranged for Ava and Miles to spend that Friday night at my sister's house 40 minutes away, telling Claire it was so we could have an uninterrupted anniversary dinner, which was, in its own strange way, entirely true. I confirmed with Denise that her final consolidated report, along with copies of every bank statement, every dated screenshot of the 2 lock screen messages I had photographed weeks earlier with my own phone the moment I'd seen them, and Miriam's preliminary notes on dissipated marital assets would all be printed and organised in a single folder I kept locked in my truck rather than anywhere inside the house, because I did not want a single piece of that file sitting anywhere Claire might stumble across it before I was ready. And then I did something I am still, honestly, a little surprised I was capable of, which is that I spent the final 10 days before that Friday behaving as completely as I could manage, exactly like a husband looking forward to his 16th anniversary, because I understood, by then, that the single greatest asset I had left in this entire situation was the fact that Claire had absolutely no idea what I already knew. I want to describe those 10 days honestly, because I think they were, in their own specific way, harder than anything that came before them or after them. I made dinner reservations I had no intention of keeping, at a restaurant we both loved, so that if Claire checked her calendar, she would see exactly the anniversary she expected. I picked out a gift, a bracelet from the little jewellery shop on Main Street, the kind of gift I would have bought her regardless of anything I had learned, because some stubborn, grieving part of me still wanted to buy my wife a bracelet for her birthday, even while another part of me was building a folder full of surveillance reports in a locked truck console. I kissed her goodbye in the mornings. I asked about her day at dinner and listened to her answer, some version of a partnership summit or a sponsor call, and I nodded along the way, I had nodded along for 14 months, except now every nod felt like its own small private act of professional discipline, a controlled performance I was giving for an audience of one, in service of a goal I had already fully decided on days earlier. Ava noticed something was different before Claire did, which still strikes me as one of the strange small mercies of that entire stretch. She's 13, and 13-year-olds notice things adults assume they're too self-absorbed to see, and one evening, about a week before the anniversary, she came and sat on the arm of my chair while I was pretending to read and said, quietly, in a voice that had none of her usual performed teenage indifference in it, "Dad, you've been weird lately. Not bad weird, just quiet weird. Is everything okay with work?" I told her, which was not entirely a lie, that work had been stressful and I had a lot on my mind, and I told her, which was completely true, that whatever happened in the next few weeks, nothing about how much I loved her and her brother was ever going to change, and she looked at me for a long moment with an expression considerably older than 13, and said, "Okay," and hugged me, and went back to her room, and I sat there afterward thinking that I had just told my daughter the truest sentence of the entire 5 weeks, without telling her a single fact contained within it. The Friday of our anniversary arrived the way Fridays do, when you have spent 10 days willing them to arrive slower. I dropped Ava and Miles at my sister Karen's house that afternoon, and Karen, who did not know anything yet, hugged me a little longer than usual on the porch and said, "Happy anniversary, you two deserve a nice quiet night." And I thanked her and got back in my truck and sat in her driveway for almost 5 minutes before I could make myself pull out onto the road, because that was the exact moment the entire 5 weeks of careful, controlled discipline nearly broke apart in my chest all at once. I want to be honest that I cried, briefly, sitting in that driveway, not from doubt about what I was about to do, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of everything I was about to lose alongside everything I was about to say. I picked up the locked folder from my truck console and brought it inside in a plain canvas bag, setting it on the bottom shelf of the hallway closet where Claire would have no reason to look, and I set the table the way we always set it for our anniversary. The good plates, the 2 candles, the bottle of wine I had actually bought earlier that week, a Cabernet from the same vineyard we had visited on our honeymoon, because I wanted this to feel, right up until the moment it stopped feeling that way, exactly like every other anniversary we had shared. Claire came home a little after 6, dressed nicely, genuinely happy in a way that, I want to be honest, still occasionally catches in my chest even now, because I do not believe her happiness at seeing that table was faked. I believe Claire was capable, right up until the last possible moment, of being completely sincere about loving me in one compartment of her life, while completely sincere about an entirely separate deception in another. And that specific human contradiction is, I think, the hardest single thing about this whole story for me to have made peace with. We ate most of the dinner normally. I want to describe that because I think it matters, the specific deliberate ordinariness of it, chicken piccata, the good wine, Claire telling me a genuinely funny story about a vendor mix-up at a recent trade show, both of us laughing, both of us, for those 45 minutes, simply a married couple having an anniversary dinner. I let that happen deliberately. I had decided in the truck outside Karen's house that I was not going to open with the file the moment she sat down, that I owed both of us, or at least I owed myself, one final, ordinary hour of the marriage I had actually had for 16 years before I ended it permanently over the one I had also, unknowingly, been living alongside for the last 14 months. When the plates were mostly empty and the second glass of wine was poured, I reached down beside my chair and set the canvas bag on the table between us, and I watched Claire's expression shift from warm to faintly curious, probably assuming it was some kind of anniversary surprise, a card, a smaller gift alongside the bracelet she didn't know about yet. I said, "Claire, I need you to look at something, and I need you to let me finish everything I have to say before you respond to any of it, because I am only going to be able to say this once, completely, and I need to say it in order." Her expression changed again, curious sliding toward uncertain, and she said, "Nathan, you're scaring me a little. What is this?" And I said, "Please, just let me start." I opened the folder and set the first item on the table, a photograph of the paint can, and I told her calmly, in the same even voice I use when I'm walking a warehouse client through a shrinkage report, exactly how I had found it, the primer, the shelf, the unexpected weight. I watched her face while I described it, and I want to be honest about what I saw because it was not immediate collapse, It was something closer to a held breath. A very still, very careful stillness that I recognized, with a small cold jolt, as the exact same professional composure I had once admired in her, the composure of a woman who is extremely good at controlling a room, now being turned, for the first time in our marriage, directly against me. I set down the 2 photographed messages next. The lock screen previews signed simply D, can't stop thinking about Tuesday, count the days till the summit, and she's the only real thing I get some weeks, you know that right. And I watched something in her face finally crack slightly at the second one. Not a full collapse, just a small involuntary flinch around her eyes. And I said, "I'm not finished yet, Claire. Please let me get through all of it." I laid out the spreadsheet next, the 26 months of statements, the 12 recurring charges from Forge Performance's billing entity, the precise correlation between each charge and an evening she had described to me as a partnership dinner or sponsor summit, going back 14 months to the exact month of her promotion. I laid out Denise's 2 surveillance reports, the side entrance, the keypad code, the second floor light dimming to a single lamp for hours at a time. I told her about the disguised app on the family iPad, Vault Notes, installed 16 months earlier, and about the small claims filing that had connected Derek Salas's old recovery email to that same account. And I told her, last, and I watched this land harder than anything else I had said, about Trish, about the afternoon she'd come by with a casserole dish and would not meet my eyes, about the half-second too long her gaze had lingered on our kitchen calendar. And I said, "Claire, I'm not asking you whether this happened. I already know it happened. I have known for 5 weeks. What I am asking you for, right now, tonight, is the truth about how long, and how much, and whether there is anything in this folder I have gotten wrong, because I would genuinely rather know that too, if it's there." Claire did not speak for what felt like an extraordinarily long time, though I know now, thinking back on it, it was probably closer to a full minute, her hands flat on the table on either side of the folder, not touching it, her eyes moving slowly over the photographs and the spreadsheet without picking any of it up, and when she finally did speak, her voice came out smaller than I had ever heard it in 16 years of marriage. All of the composure I had watched her hold onto for the first part of my presentation finally giving way at once. She said, 14 months. You have the date right. It started in August, right after the promotion. And I want to be honest that hearing her confirm the exact month I had already calculated did not feel like vindication. It felt like a second, entirely separate wave of loss. Because some very small, very stubborn part of me, even after everything, had apparently been holding out for a version of this conversation where I was wrong about at least one detail. I asked her, and I kept my voice level doing it. The same leveling technique I use walking into a room with an employee I'm about to discipline, whether it had ever stopped, whether there had been a period in those 14 months where she had genuinely tried to end it, and she said, twice. I tried to end it twice, once around month 6 and once about 10 weeks ago, and both times Derek made it sound so reasonable to keep going, just until the full corporate wellness contract renewal, just until this next thing, and both times I let him talk me back into it because some part of me had stopped being able to imagine telling you the truth, so I kept choosing the version of my life where I didn't have to. I asked her why the phone, why the paint, and specifically, why hide it in our own garage rather than somewhere it could never be found at all, and she said, and I believe this was the most honest single sentence she said that entire night, "I don't fully know, Nathan. I think some part of me needed it close enough to the house that I couldn't fully pretend the 2 parts of my life were as separate as I was telling myself they were. I think I hid it somewhere I might get caught on purpose, without ever letting myself admit that's what I was doing." I asked about Trish, and Claire's face went through something complicated when I said the name, guilt layered over a kind of protective loyalty even in that moment, and she said, "Trish told me 8 months ago I needed to end it or tell you myself, and I promised her I would handle it, and I didn't, and I made her carry that for 8 months because I was too much of a coward to carry it myself, and if you're angry at her, be angry at me instead. She didn't do anything except trust me when I said I'd fix it." I want to be honest that I did not, in that moment, feel much capacity for anger at Trish specifically. My anger by that point had narrowed itself entirely onto the 2 people actually responsible. But I noted quietly that even in the middle of confessing to the worst thing she'd ever done to me, Claire's first instinct was still to manage the room, to protect someone else's exposure before fully sitting in her own, and I filed that observation away the same clinical way I had filed away everything else, over the preceding 5 weeks. I told her, finally, about the financial piece, about Miriam, about dissipation of marital assets, and I watched something shift in her face that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The specific expression of someone recalculating a situation they had believed was purely emotional into one that also had hard financial consequences attached, and she said quietly, "Are you saying you're going to use money against me in a divorce?" And I said, "Claire, I'm saying that 14 months of hotel rooms and a private office lease got paid for somehow, and some portion of that money came out of accounts I have equal legal claim to, and I'm not going to pretend that fact doesn't exist just because saying it out loud makes this feel more transactional than it already unavoidably is." She didn't have a response to that, and I remember the silence that followed being the first moment that entire night where I felt, underneath the grief, something that was unmistakably close to a cold, settled clarity. The specific feeling of a case fully built and no longer requiring my emotional participation to hold its own weight. We talked for almost 3 more hours that night, long after the candles had burned down and the wine had gone flat in both our glasses, and I am not going to pretend the entire conversation stayed as controlled as its opening. There was a stretch, close to midnight, where Claire cried in a way I had only seen a handful of times across 16 years. Her father's funeral, the night Miles was born 6 weeks early and spent 4 days in the NICU, and some part of me, even then, some old, worn groove of 16 years of loving this specific person, wanted to cross the kitchen and hold her the way I would have on any other terrible night in our marriage. And I did not do that, not because I lacked the impulse, but because I understood, with total clarity, that comforting her through the pain of having been caught was not a kindness I owed her anymore, and drawing that line, in that specific moment, was one of the hardest single things I've ever done in my life. I asked her, near the end of that conversation, the one question I had genuinely not been able to answer for myself across 5 weeks of investigation, which was simply why. Not why Derek specifically, I understood the broad shape of that. A man who made her feel, in her own words later, interesting again in a way that had nothing to do with being someone's wife or someone's mother, but why she had never once, in 14 months, simply told me she was unhappy, given me the chance to fix whatever needed fixing before it became this. And her answer, delivered quietly, staring at the folder rather than at me, was the sentence I have turned over more than any other single thing she said that night. I didn't feel unhappy enough to blow up our whole life over it, Nathan, and I also didn't feel happy enough to stop, and I think I told myself, every single week for 14 months, that I would stop soon. Right up until stopping stopped being a decision I was actually making and started being just a thing I said to myself to keep going. I don't have a better answer than that, and I know it isn't a good one. I told her before we finally went to bed in separate rooms that night for what would turn out to be the last time we ever slept under the same roof as a married couple, that I had already spoken with Miriam Katz, that I intended to file for divorce, and that I was not interested in a trial separation or a period of working on things through counselling, because the specific kind of trust required to rebuild 16 years on top of 14 months of a hidden phone and a disguised app was not something I believed either of us could manufacture through effort alone. I told her I did not say any of this out of cruelty, and I meant it. I said it because I had spent 5 weeks building the most honest, complete picture of my own life that I had ever built, and the picture that resulted did not include a version where I trusted her again, no matter how much either of us might have wanted one to exist. There is one more exchange from that anniversary dinner I want to tell you about, because I have never repeated it to anyone else in full, not even Paul, and I think it belongs in this story rather than staying folded away the way that phone once was. Near the very end of the night, close to 2 a.m, after the anger and the crying and the long, exhausting accounting of facts had mostly burned themselves out, Claire asked me a question I did not expect. She said, "Nathan, when you were sitting in that garage with the phone in your hands that very first day, before you knew anything else, what did you actually feel? Because I've spent 5 weeks imagining you must have hated me in that moment, and I need to know if that's true." I thought about it carefully before I answered, because I wanted to give her something honest rather than something designed to wound or to comfort. I told her that I had not felt hatred in that first moment. I had felt something closer to a very quiet, very total disorientation. The specific feeling of the floor of your own house turning out to be built over a basement you never knew existed, and that the hatred, if any part of what I felt over the following weeks deserved that word at all, had come later, slowly, built the same deliberate way I had built the spreadsheet, one verified fact at a time, and that even now, sitting across from her with the folder between us, I did not think hatred was actually the most accurate word for what I felt. I told her the most accurate word was probably grief. Grief for a version of our life together that I had believed was permanent and now understood had been running alongside a second hidden version for over a year, and that grief and hatred, in my experience of the last 5 weeks, are not actually the same emotion wearing different names. They are two completely different things, and I was mostly in that specific 2 a.m. moment simply grieving. Claire cried again when I said that, quietly, and said, "That's worse, somehow, than if you said you hated me," and I told her I understood why it might feel that way, but that I had not built 5 weeks of careful, disciplined investigation in order to arrive at a comfortable answer for her. I had built it to arrive at an accurate one for myself, and the accurate one was grief. Complicated, enormous, entirely genuine grief, sitting right alongside a clarity about what needed to happen next that I did not expect to feel quite so certain about, until I actually said the words out loud. We sat in silence for a while after that, the candles long since burned all the way down, both of us simply tired in the specific bone-deep way that only comes after telling someone the most important true things you have to tell them, and eventually she said quietly, "I know I don't get to ask you for anything else tonight, but I hope, eventually, however long it takes, you find your way to being genuinely happy again," and I meant that when I said it back to her, that I hoped the same for her, because whatever she had done, 16 years of loving someone does not simply convert into wishing them a bad life afterward. At least it did not for me, and I think that specific complicated capacity to be devastated by someone and still, underneath it, wish them an eventually decent life is one of the truer and stranger things I learned about myself during that entire 5-week ordeal. I want to add one final detail about that night before I move on, because I think it is the single image from the entire ordeal that has stayed with me most clearly, more than the paint can, more than the folder, more than any single sentence either of us said. After Claire finally went upstairs to sleep in the guest room, the first of what would become many nights in that room before she moved out entirely, I stayed downstairs alone at the kitchen table for a long time, the candles fully melted down to nothing, the folder still sitting where I had left it, and I remember looking at the bracelet I had bought her, still wrapped in its small box, sitting on the counter where I had set it earlier that evening, before any of the conversation had happened, back when I was still for one last hour simply a husband preparing an anniversary surprise. I did not throw it away that night, and I did not give it to her either. I put it in a drawer in my desk, the same drawer where Denise's report now sits, and it is still there today, 2.5 years later, an object I have never quite decided what to do with. Not because I am holding on to any hope of using it for its original purpose, but because I think some part of me understands that certain objects end up marking the exact last moment of a life you didn't know was about to end, and there is a kind of quiet honesty in simply letting that object exist somewhere in a drawer, unresolved, rather than pretending I could cleanly dispose of every physical trace of the night my marriage actually ended, even while the legal ending still took 5 more months to catch up to what both of us already knew, sitting at that table, long after midnight, on what turned out to be the last anniversary either of us would ever call our own. I think about that bracelet sometimes, more than I probably should, not with longing exactly, but with a specific kind of respect for how strange grief actually is in practice. How it does not arrive in the clean, single wave people expect before they've lived through something like this themselves, but in scattered, uneven pieces. A drawer here, a guard shelf there, a Sunday phone call, a swim meet cheer section, a bridge you propose on twice to 2 different women 11 years apart, each piece carrying its own small weight long after the main event has technically concluded. I do not think that scattered quality is a flaw in how I processed everything that happened to me. I think it is simply the honest shape of what living through a long betrayal and a slow, careful reckoning with it actually looks like, and I would rather tell you that true, uneven shape than a cleaner story that wrapped up faster and tidier than mine actually did, because I suspect the true, uneven shape is the one that will actually be useful to whoever is listening to this and currently standing somewhere in the middle of their own long, quiet, 5-week version of the exact same thing. I want to tell you about the morning after because it was, in its own quiet way, almost as hard as the confrontation itself. I picked up Ava and Miles from my sister's house, around 10, and Karen took one look at my face in her doorway and did not ask a single question in front of the kids, simply squeezed my arm once, hard, and said, "Call me tonight," and I did. I drove the kids home in near silence, Miles narrating something about a trade he was planning to make with a friend at school, Ava quiet in the passenger seat in the specific way she gets quiet when she's reading a room more carefully than she's letting on. And when we got home, Claire was already gone, having left for her sister Renee's house that morning before we returned. A fact we had agreed on the night before, that she would give me the space to figure out how and when to tell the kids without her in the house complicating it further. I did not tell Ava and Miles everything that week, and I want to be honest that I've gone back and forth since about whether I handled that part correctly. What I told them, sitting them down together at the kitchen table 2 days later, was that your mother and I are getting a divorce, that this is not because of anything either of you did or could have done anything about, that we both love you exactly as much as we did last week, and that is never going to change no matter what our living situation looks like going forward, and that some of the specific reasons grown-ups make this decision are things that belong to grown-ups. Not because we don't trust you with the truth, but because some of it isn't mine or your mother's alone to tell you. It involves other people's privacy too. Miles cried, the specific unguarded crying of a 9-year-old who does not yet have any defense mechanisms built up against genuinely bad news, and I held him for a long time on the kitchen floor while he asked, over and over, if it was because of something he did, and I told him, as many times as he needed to hear it, that it was not, that it would never be that this was entirely between two adults, and had nothing whatsoever to do with him or his sister. Ava did not cry in front of us, which worried me more than if she had, and it was not until almost a week later, lying on her bed while I sat on the edge of it, that she finally said quietly, staring at the ceiling, "I know it's not really both of your faults, Dad. I heard you and Mum talking that night before the meeting with the lawyers. I wasn't trying to listen. I just couldn't sleep and I was in the hallway, and I sat with that for a long moment before answering honestly, because I had decided somewhere in the preceding 5 weeks that whatever I chose not to volunteer to my children, I was not going to actively lie to them if they asked me something directly. I told her, as gently and as honestly as I could manage, that she was right, that this was not a 50-50 situation, but that I did not want her carrying anger toward her mother as some kind of loyalty test to me, because her mother loved her completely and always would, and that people are capable of loving their children perfectly, while still making serious mistakes in other parts of their lives, and that both things were true about her mother at once. The divorce proceedings themselves took just under 5 months from filing to finalization, considerably faster than Miriam had initially prepared me to expect, largely because the evidentiary file Denise and I had built was thorough enough that Claire's own attorney, after reviewing it, advised her, according to Miriam's later account of a conversation between counsel, that contesting the dissipation of assets claim would likely cost more in legal fees than simply agreeing to it. In the end, the settlement credited me, on top of an otherwise even division of our joint property, an amount just under $26,000, representing Miriam's calculated estimate of marital funds spent across 14 months on hotel stays, the private office lease supplement, and related expenses traced through the joint account and corroborated by Denise's investigative file, a number that will never fully capture what those 14 months actually cost me, but that mattered enormously in a very specific practical way, because it was the exact amount, almost to the dollar, that allowed me to buy out my share of necessary repairs on the house on Bellwood Court, which I kept, with Claire's agreement, so that Ava and Miles would not also have to lose their home on top of everything else changing at once. I want to tell you what happened to Derek Salis, because I know people ask, and because it is, in its own way, one of the parts of this story that surprised me most. I did not go looking for a confrontation with him, and I want to be honest that in the immediate aftermath of that anniversary dinner, some raw, unprocessed part of me wanted exactly that. Wanted to drive to Forge Performance and say something I would probably have regretted. I did not do that, partly because Miriam had been extremely clear that anything resembling harassment or confrontation on my part could complicate the legal proceedings, and partly because Paul, sitting on his porch again 2 nights after the anniversary dinner, said something that stuck with me. "Nathan," he said, "that guy already has to live the rest of his life as the guy who did this. You don't need to add anything to that sentence. It's already got everything in it that matters." What I learned instead, entirely second-hand, through the slow, inevitable channels that small towns use to circulate this kind of information, was that Derek Salis was himself married, to a woman named Rachel Salis, with a 6-year-old son I had not previously known existed, and that Rachel had, according to Trish, who reached out to me directly about 6 weeks after the divorce filing in what I understood to be a genuine guilty attempt to make some kind of amends, found out about the affair within days of my confrontation with Claire through a source neither Trish nor I have ever fully identified, possibly Claire herself in some late complicated moment of shared reckoning between the two women involved. Rachel filed for divorce from Derek less than a month later. I have never met her, and I have never sought to meet her, though I have thought about her more than I expected to. A woman I have never spoken to, raising a 6-year-old alone now, whose own 14 months of unexplained late nights and business trips I now understand, with a certainty I take no pleasure in, were never actually about the corporate wellness contract renewals Derek had presumably told her they were about. Forge Performance lost its co-branding partnership with Ironline Fitness within 2 months, a decision made, according to a former co-worker of Claire's who reached out to me with an awkwardness I appreciated more than she probably realised, by Ironline's own corporate leadership once whispers of the situation reached a level that made the partnership a liability, regardless of anyone's personal feelings about it. Derek's business did not fail outright. Cedar Falls is not a large enough town for me to have entirely lost track of it, but I understand it operates on a considerably smaller scale now than it did 14 months into whatever this actually was. And I want to be honest that I derive very little satisfaction from that fact, because it does not undo a single hour of the 5 weeks I spent building a case against my own marriage, and it does not repair whatever Rachel Salis' son will eventually be told at some age about why his parents no longer live in the same house. I want to go back and tell you about the 6 weeks between the anniversary dinner and the actual filing of the divorce paperwork, because it was not the clean, immediate break some people probably imagine when they hear a story like this told in summary. Claire asked me twice in that stretch whether there was any version of this where we tried counselling before finalising anything, and I want to be honest that I took both requests seriously enough to sit with them for several days each, rather than dismissing them outright, because some part of me, even after everything, was not eager to be the man who ended a 16-year marriage without at least fully examining every alternative. I went so far as to call a marriage counsellor recommended by Miriam, a woman named Dr. Feldstein, who specialised specifically in infidelity recovery, and I had one individual session with her, alone, before deciding anything further, and what she told me in that single session has stayed with me since. Mr. Reeve, she said, reconciliation after an affair is absolutely possible in many marriages. I want to be clear, I'm not telling you it never works, but it requires both partners to want it for the marriage itself, not out of fear of the alternative, and it requires the partner who broke trust to be able to fully account for why, without minimizing it, and it requires the hurt partner to actually want to rebuild rather than to want to punish through the process of appearing to rebuild. From what you've described to me, it sounds like you've already done the hardest, most honest accounting of anyone I've spoken with in this chair in some time, and I think you already know your answer. You're just checking, one more time, whether you're allowed to have it. I left that session and called Claire that same evening and told her, as gently and as finely as I could, that I had given it real consideration, and that my answer was still no, not out of anger, but because I did not believe I could rebuild a version of trust that would ever feel like anything other than a performance of forgiveness rather than the real thing, and that she deserved, eventually, a marriage or a partnership built on something more solid than my own forced effort, the same way I deserved that too. My mother, when I finally told her about 3 weeks into the process, reacted in a way that surprised me, not with the outrage I half expected, but with a long, tired sigh, and the specific sentence, "Nathan, I loved Claire. I still do in a lot of ways, and I'm so sorry," and then, after a pause, "Are you handling the money side of this the smart way? Because your father's brother went through this in the 80s and let his anger cost him half of what he should have kept. Don't let feelings make you sloppy about the practical parts." It was such a specifically pragmatic piece of advice, and I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in almost a month, because it was exactly the kind of thing my mother would say, grief and practicality arriving in the same breath, and I told her that Miriam already had that handled, and she said, "Good, then go be sad properly. You've earned that too." Claire's parents, whom I had known for 18 years by that point and had genuinely loved as my own extended family, handled it with a complicated grief of their own that I did not expect and that, honestly, moved me more than I anticipated it would. Her father called me directly, about a month into the proceedings, and said, "Nathan, I'm not going to pretend I know everything that happened. and I'm not going to ask you to relitigate it with me, but I want you to know that whatever my daughter did, you have been nothing but a good husband and a good father in this family for 16 years, and that doesn't stop being true just because this ended badly. I hope you know you're always welcome at our table, divorce or not. And I remember sitting with the phone against my ear in my truck in the Corland parking lot, genuinely undone by that call in a way none of the legal proceedings had managed to undo me, because it was the first piece of the whole ordeal that felt like something other than loss. I want to tell you about a specific evening, about 10 weeks into the separation, because I think it captures something true about how slowly and unevenly grief like this actually resolves, contrary to how cleanly these stories sometimes get told after the fact. Claire had come by to pick up some of her remaining things from the house, an arrangement we had worked out through our attorneys to happen during hours the kids were at school, and I had genuinely intended to simply let her in, help load a few boxes into her car, and leave it entirely businesslike the way I had managed most of our necessary interactions by that point. Instead, she stood in the doorway of what had been our bedroom for 12 years, looking at the room, and said, quietly, "I keep trying to figure out the exact day I stopped being able to imagine telling you the truth, and I can't find it, Nathan. I've looked for it for 2 months, and there isn't one single day. It just got a little further away every week until I couldn't see it anymore." And I told her, honestly, standing in that doorway with a box of her sweaters in my arms, that I believed her, that I didn't think there had been one single day either, and that this was in some ways the part of the whole thing I found hardest to sit with, not the dramatic betrayal itself, but the specific unglamorous truth that most people don't fall out of a marriage in one moment. They drift out of it in 1,000 small, individually forgivable choices that only add up to something unforgivable when you finally lay them all out on a table at once. She cried again, briefly, and I did not comfort her, but I did not walk away either, and I think that specific uncomfortable middle ground, neither cruelty nor reconciliation, ended up being the honest shape of most of our interactions for the several months it took to fully finalize everything. I want to tell you about a complication that arose in the middle of the proceedings that I did not anticipate, because I think it is the kind of detail these stories often leave out in favor of a cleaner narrative, and I promised myself I would tell this one completely. About 2 months into the separation, Claire's attorney, a sharp, capable woman named Sandra Kwan, filed a motion challenging the specific dissipation figure Miriam had calculated, arguing that a portion of the joint account spending Denise and I had traced to the affair actually represented legitimate business development expenses tied to Iron Line's genuine co-branding relationship with Forge Performance, expenses Claire's role as Vice President of Partnerships would have required her to incur regardless of any personal relationship with Derek Salis. I want to be honest that this motion frightened me more than almost anything else in the entire legal process, not because I doubted the underlying truth of what had happened, but because I understood from my own professional life exactly how a well-argued technicality can unravel an otherwise solid case if the documentation isn't airtight. Miriam did not panic, which steadied me considerably, and instead asked Denise to go back through her file and produce something more specific than the recurring charge pattern alone, an itemized comparison between actual, verifiable Iron Line corporate marketing budget records, obtained through a formal discovery request Miriam filed directly against Claire's own employer, and the personal joint account charges in question. It took 3 additional weeks, and I want to describe the specific tension of that stretch, because it was the one period in the entire 5 months where I genuinely did not know which way the outcome would land. Denise's supplemental report, when it finally came back, showed something that even I had not expected in its precision. Every single genuine, documented Iron Line marketing expense tied to the Forge Performance partnership had been processed correctly through Iron Line's own corporate accounts payable system and reimbursed to Claire's Iron Line-issued corporate card, exactly as company policy required. Every one of the 12 charges on our personal joint account, by contrast, fell on dates and in amounts that did not correspond to a single, legitimate marketing invoice anywhere in Iron Line's own discovery-produced records. Sandra Kwan withdrew the motion 4 days after receiving that supplemental report, and Miriam told me afterward, with the particular satisfaction of a professional watching a well-built case hold under direct pressure, that withdrawal was as close to an admission as we were likely to get in writing that the original figure had been accurate all along. I want to tell you about something that happened at work during this same stretch, because Corland Distribution is a mid-sized company in a small enough regional industry that word travels, However, discreetly people try to keep it contained. My direct supervisor, a plain-spoken regional director named Frank Delgado, called me into his office about 10 weeks into the separation, not to discuss the divorce directly, but to tell me in his characteristically blunt way that he'd noticed my performance hadn't slipped at all, despite what he understood, through channels he didn't specify, to be a difficult personal stretch, and that he wanted me to know the company would work with me on any scheduling flexibility I needed for custody arrangements or legal appointments, no questions asked, because in his words, you've spent 17 years building a reputation here as the guy who doesn't let personal chaos become other people's problem, and I'm not about to make you prove that all over again during the one stretch of your life you actually need us to bend a little. I want to be honest that small, unprompted kindness mattered more to me during that period than almost any single piece of legal progress, because it was proof, arriving from a direction I hadn't expected, that the discipline and steadiness I had built my entire professional identity around had not gone unnoticed, even while my personal life was quietly falling apart around it. Paul remained, throughout all of it, the single most consistent presence outside my own household, and I want to tell you about one particular night, close to the 4-month mark, because it captures something about our friendship that I think matters to this story. I had gone over to his place after a particularly grueling mediation session over the final custody schedule, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness, and I sat on his porch and for the first time in the entire ordeal, simply put my head in my hands and did not try to compose myself into anything resembling the calm, controlled man I'd been presenting to attorneys and mediators and my own children for months. Paul did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, quietly, "You know, you've spent 5 months being the most disciplined guy I've ever watched go through something like this, and I need you to know it's okay if tonight you're just a guy whose whole life got taken apart by somebody he trusted completely. You don't have to hold the audit file version of yourself together on my porch. That version's for the lawyers." I cried harder that night than I had at any single point since the anniversary dinner itself, and I think, looking back, it was the exact release valve I had needed and had not allowed myself to fully access anywhere else, because everywhere else in my life during those 5 months I had needed to be the steady one. For Ava and Miles, for the mediators, for my own case, and Paul's porch. That specific night was the only place I let myself simply be a man grieving something enormous instead of a man managing a process. The custody arrangement we eventually settled on, after that grueling mediation session and 2 follow-up sessions afterward, gave me primary residential custody of both Ava and Miles, with Claire receiving alternating weekends and 1 weeknight dinner, an arrangement neither of us had initially expected since Ohio courts generally favour something closer to an even split, when both parents are, as Claire genuinely was, involved and loving parents with no history of neglect. What tipped the arrangement toward primary custody with me, according to Miriam's explanation of the Guardian ad litem's report, was a combination of factors, my more stable and predictable work schedule against Claire's travel-heavy VP role, the fact that the children had expressed, in their own private interviews with the court-appointed evaluator, a clear preference for staying in the house on Bellwood Court where they had always lived, and, though this was never stated as explicitly in the paperwork, a general pattern in the evaluator's report noting that Claire's own account of her schedule over the preceding 14 months contained enough inconsistencies, once cross-referenced against the evidentiary file, to raise mild concerns about reliability that the evaluator felt obligated to note, even without directly referencing the affair itself in those exact terms. I want to be honest that watching Claire receive that custody outcome was one of the only moments in the entire process where I felt something uncomfortably close to guilt rather than vindication, because whatever she had done to me, she had never once, in 16 years, been anything less than a devoted present mother to Ava and Miles, and some part of me wanted to tell the evaluator, in that moment, that her failures as a wife should not be allowed to bleed into an unfair judgment of her as a mother. Miriam gently reminded me, when I raised this concern with her directly, that the arrangement was not a punishment, it was a reflection of practical realities the court was required to weigh, and that Claire's own parenting time, while reduced from an even split, remained substantial and protected, and that my discomfort with the outcome, however well-intentioned, was not actually mine to relitigate on Claire's behalf once the evaluator had done her independent work. Claire moved, about 5 months after the anniversary dinner, into a townhouse on the other side of Cedar Falls, close enough that the kids' transitions between houses remained simple, far enough that I did not have to drive past it in the ordinary course of my own daily errands unless I chose to. I helped her move 2 boxes of books that had gotten left behind in the chaos of the actual moving day, an act of practical decency that surprised both of us a little, and I remember her saying, standing in the mostly empty garage of the house we'd shared for 11 years, "Thank you for this, Nathan, and for everything else you've done that you didn't have to do. The custody arrangement, letting me still come to Miles's basketball games, not making the kids choose sides even when you'd have had every right to." And I told her honestly that I hadn't done any of that for her. I'd done it because Ava and Miles deserved 2 parents who could still function like adults around each other, and that this was, in the end, simply one more version of the same discipline I had built the entire case around in the first place, doing the difficult thing correctly, rather than doing the easy thing that felt good in the moment. I want to tell you about the day the paperwork actually finalised, because it was, in its own way, almost anticlimactic after 5 months of build-up. I sat in a courtroom in the county courthouse, the same building whose parking lot I had driven past 1,000 times, without ever imagining I would sit inside it for this specific reason, and a judge whose name I still remember, Judge Averill, a tired, efficient woman who had clearly processed 1,000 divorces before ours, and would process 1,000 more after it, read through the settlement terms in a flat, business-like voice, confirmed that both parties understood and agreed to the terms, and pronounced the marriage of Nathan Reeve and Claire Reeve legally dissolved in less time than it takes to order a meal at a restaurant. Claire and I did not speak on the courthouse steps afterward, beyond a brief, mutual nod that felt less like anger and more like 2 people acknowledging they had both survived something difficult. And I remember driving home that afternoon feeling, for the first time in 5 months, a specific kind of quiet I hadn't experienced since before the Saturday I found that paint can, not happiness exactly, but the particular stillness of a process finally, completely finished, a file closed and filed away rather than sitting open on my desk demanding constant attention. I need to tell you about something that happened almost exactly a month after the divorce was finalised, because I did not expect it, and because I think it changed how I understood the entire 14 months, retroactively, one more time. Trish Whitmore called me directly on a Tuesday evening, her voice carrying a specific nervous tightness I recognised from the day of the casserole dish, and she said, "Nathan, I need to tell you something I've been sitting on, and I need you to know I've gone back and forth for weeks about whether it's mine to tell, and I've decided you deserve to know it." She told me that the affair had not in fact begun in August, the month of Claire's promotion, the month I had calculated with such confidence from the recurring charges and the timeline of the disguised app. It had begun almost 4 months earlier, in the spring during a series of preliminary partnership meetings that predated the formal promotion announcement, meetings Claire had described to me at the time as routine vendor evaluation sessions, and Trish told me she had known about this earlier timeline for almost the entire 14 months, not just the 8 months she'd previously admitted to, because Claire had confided in her the very week it started, sitting in Trish's kitchen, crying, saying she didn't know what she was doing but couldn't seem to stop herself. I sat with that revision for several days before I decided what, if anything, to do with it, because the divorce was already finalised, the settlement already calculated and paid, and I understood that reopening the financial case at this stage would be legally complicated and emotionally exhausting for very little practical gain. What the revised timeline did change, permanently, was something quieter and more internal, a recalibration of exactly how much of what I had believed about my marriage during that specific spring had been real. I had a distinct memory, once Trish told me this, of a work trip Claire and I had taken together that same March, a long weekend in Cincinnati for a friend's 40th birthday, a trip I remembered as one of the genuinely happiest weekends of our marriage, and I sat with the specific unwelcome recalculation that whatever Claire had already started 4 months into a relationship I did not yet know existed, some part of her had still been capable of that entire happy weekend being real to her too, or at least real enough that I could not, and still cannot, fully separate which of my memories from that final year were untouched by what was happening underneath them and which were not. I called Miriam to ask, purely out of intellectual thoroughness rather than any real intention to act on it, whether the revised timeline changed anything legally, and she told me, kindly but plainly, that it likely would not move the settlement meaningfully at this stage, 4 additional months of a pattern that had already been established and compensated for would not be worth the cost and delay of reopening litigation, and she gently suggested that this particular piece of information might be one I chose to hold for my own understanding rather than pursue for any practical outcome. I took her advice, and I want to be honest that deciding not to act on it, simply absorbing one more painful fact and setting it down rather than picking up a fight over it, was its own kind of difficult discipline, a smaller echo of the same choice I had made in that grade months earlier, deciding what to do with new information before letting the emotional reaction to it dictate my next move. I did eventually tell Claire that I knew about the revised timeline, not as an accusation, and not as an attempt to reopen anything financial, but simply because I did not want to carry one more piece of information about our marriage that she did not know I had. I called her on a Sunday afternoon, several weeks later, and told her, calmly, that Trish had told me the truth about the spring, and I asked her, one last time, whether there was anything else from those 14 months that I did not yet know, and that she thought I deserved to know before we both moved fully into whatever came next. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "No, Nathan, that's the last piece. I promise you that's genuinely the last piece, and I want you to know I'm not proud of how long the actual truth took to catch up with what I let you believe, even after everything else. I told her I believed her, and I want to be honest that I did, mostly, though I have also made a kind of peace with the possibility that I will never have perfect, complete certainty about every detail of those 14 months, and that this specific, permanent incompleteness is simply part of what I now carry forward, an asterisk on an otherwise closed file that will likely never fully resolve itself, no matter how much of my professional instinct still wants a clean, verified, final number. I want to tell you about the specific rhythm of the first 6 months of life on Bellwood Court with just the 3 of us, because I think it matters to anyone listening who is standing somewhere near the beginning of a story like this one, wondering whether the other side of it is livable. It was harder than I expected in some ways, and considerably easier in others. The easier part, and I say this without any pride attached to it, simply as an observed fact, was the house itself, because Ava and Miles had grown up in it, and keeping them in the same bedrooms, the same school, the same swim club and robotics team, meant that the actual daily architecture of their lives changed far less than I had feared it would in the darkest weeks of the investigation, when I imagined, at various points, that ending the marriage might mean uprooting everything else alongside it. The harder part was almost entirely mine to carry alone, the specific loneliness of a house built for 2 adults now run by 1, the particular silence of a kitchen at 10 at night after the kids were asleep, no one to talk through the day with, no one to hand half the parenting logistics to during a rough week. Miles adjusted, in the specific resilient way 9-year-olds often do, faster than I expected and in ways that occasionally caught me off guard. About 4 months into the new arrangement, he asked me, completely out of nowhere while we were sorting his basketball cards on the living room floor, whether it was okay that he still loved Mom exactly the same amount even though what she did had made me sad, and I told him, as clearly as I could manage, that it was not just okay, it was exactly what I wanted for him, that loving his mother fully and understanding that grown-ups make serious mistakes were 2 things he was allowed to hold at the same time, without one cancelling out the other, and he nodded, satisfied in the specific, uncomplicated way children are satisfied when an adult gives them permission for something they were already quietly doing anyway. Ava's adjustment was slower and more complicated, and I want to be honest about a specific conversation we had about 8 months in, because I think it's the single most important conversation to come out of this entire ordeal, more important in its own way than anything I said to Claire at that anniversary dinner. Ava had started, that spring, her first real relationship, a boy from her swim club named Josh, sweet and awkward in the specific way 14-year-old boys are sweet and awkward, and one night, driving her home from a meet, she asked me, staring out the passenger window rather than at me, "Dad, how do you know if someone's lying to you? Like really know, not just guessing?" I understood immediately that she was not asking about Josh specifically. She was asking about the entire architecture of trust that had quietly collapsed in her own house over the preceding year, and I thought carefully before I answered, because I understood this was a conversation she would likely carry with her for a long time. I told her, honestly, that you mostly can't know for certain, not in the moment, that even people who love each other very much are capable of lying convincingly for a long time, and that I did not want her walking away from what happened to her mother and me, believing that love is fake or that everyone is secretly lying, because that would be its own kind of damage, a different but equally serious injury layered on top of the first one. What I told her instead was that the thing worth paying attention to isn't whether you can catch every lie in the moment, because you usually can't. It's whether the people in your life, over time, in the small, unglamorous everyday moments, act in ways that are honest, even when it would be easier not to be. Whether they tell you the annoying, inconvenient truth about small things, because people who lie about small things easily will eventually lie about big things too. And people who tell you the truth even when it costs them something small are the people who are more likely to tell you the truth when it costs them something large. I told her that her mother is, in almost every other respect, an honest, good person, and that what happened between us does not erase that, it exists alongside it. The same uncomfortable, complicated truth I had been sitting with myself for the better part of a year by then. Ava was quiet for a long time after that, and then she said simply, "Thanks, Dad." And I think about that car ride more than almost any other single conversation from that entire first year, because I think it was the moment I understood that, whatever else this ordeal had cost our family, I had at least been given the chance to hand my daughter something useful out of the wreckage of it. I ran into Derek Salis exactly once, about 7 months after the divorce, at a hardware store on the edge of town, both of us reaching for the same shelf of furnace filters on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, and I want to describe what happened, because it was almost entirely anticlimactic in a way that surprised me. He saw me first, and I watched something pass across his face, a flinch, a half-formed impulse to say something, and I simply looked at him, without any particular expression I was aware of constructing, and said nothing at all, and after a long, uncomfortable few seconds he looked away first and walked to a different aisle, and that was the entire interaction. I stood there afterward, furnace filter in hand, waiting to feel something dramatic, anger, satisfaction, some kind of closure, and instead I mostly just felt tired. The specific tiredness of a man who has already done all of his hardest emotional work in a locked truck console, and a quiet garage, and a 5-week spreadsheet months earlier, with nothing left over to spend on a man buying furnace filters in a hardware store who no longer had any real power over the shape of my life at all. I want to tell you about work during that same stretch, because I think it matters to understanding how a person actually rebuilds a life after something like this, not through some dramatic reinvention, but through the same unglamorous discipline that got me through the investigation in the first place, simply applied to ordinary days instead of a case file. Frank Delgado, true to his word, gave me the scheduling flexibility I needed for custody exchanges and the occasional counselling appointment. I eventually started attending myself, individually, with a different therapist than the one who had counselled Claire and me together, a quiet, direct man named Dr. O.C. who specialised in helping people rebuild trust in their own judgment after a significant betrayal, since I had discovered, somewhere around month 4, that the hardest lingering injury from the whole ordeal was not missing Claire specifically. It was a corrosive, low-grade doubt about my own ability to read people accurately, a doubt that showed up in strange places, a nagging suspicion about a new hire at work whose explanations for a scheduling mistake felt slightly too smooth, an unwarranted wariness toward a woman Paul's wife tried to set me up with almost a year in, simply because her explanation for why she was running late to our first coffee meeting happened to remind me, in some small, unfair way, of Claire's old vocabulary about a summit running long. Dr. O.C. helped me understand that this specific kind of hypervigilance is an extremely common after-effect of discovering a long-term betrayal, and that the goal was not to return to some naive pre-garage version of myself, who trusted automatically and without calibration, because that version of me, however happier he might have felt in the moment, had also been the version who missed 14 months of a pattern sitting in plain sight. The goal, Dr. O.C. told me, is to become someone who trusts accurately, who can tell the difference between an ordinary, unremarkable inconsistency in someone's story and an actual pattern worth paying attention to. The same distinction, he pointed out, smiling slightly, that I had already demonstrated I was capable of making methodically over 5 weeks, when it mattered most. I found something genuinely useful in hearing my own investigation described back to me not as an act of paranoia or coldness, which is how I had sometimes privately judged myself for it in the months since, but as a form of careful, disciplined love, the specific kind of love that refuses to act on an unverified assumption about the person it's protecting. whether that person is a warehouse client, a marriage, or, eventually, myself. Denise Falk and I stayed in occasional contact after the case closed, mostly a card at the holidays, and she called me once, about 10 months after the divorce finalised, to tell me, in the plain-spoken way I had come to appreciate from our very first meeting, that she wanted me to know she'd handled dozens of cases like mine over 16 years as a detective and private investigator, and that the specific combination of patience and discipline I'd shown, waiting 5 full weeks, building the complete file before saying a single word was rarer than people might assume. Most clients want to act within days of finding the first piece of evidence, and it usually costs them the case, and sometimes costs them the kids too. I want to be honest that hearing that from someone whose entire profession is watching people go through exactly this kind of ordeal meant more to me than almost any other piece of external validation in the whole process, because it told me that whatever else had been taken from me over those 14 months, the specific discipline I had brought to reclaiming the truth was, in its own way, something worth being proud of rather than something to feel cold or calculating about. Paul's wife did eventually succeed, about 14 months after the divorce, in introducing me to a woman named Colleen Marsh, a physical therapist who worked, coincidentally enough given everything that had happened, at a competing wellness clinic on the opposite side of the county from Iron Line. And I want to tell you honestly that our first several dates were considerably more cautious and considerably less romantic than either of us probably wanted, because I found myself, almost against my will, running a kind of quiet internal audit on every small inconsistency in her stories, checking timelines against what she'd told me before, noticing myself doing it and feeling a fresh wave of grief that I had become a man who does that on a first date. I told her honestly, on our third date, sitting in a small Italian restaurant 2 towns over, exactly why I was the way I was, the paint can, the 5 weeks, the divorce, and she listened without flinching and told me, when I finished, that she appreciated me telling her the truth about my own baggage rather than pretending it wasn't there, and that she was not going anywhere, and that she understood if it took me considerably longer than most people to fully believe that. It has, in fact, taken considerably longer, and we are, as of this recording, still together, still slow, still careful in a way I suspect will never entirely go away, and I have made a kind of peace with that too, understanding that some forms of caution, once earned the hard way, are not a flaw to be cured, but simply a permanent, reasonable feature of how I now move through the world. I want to tell you about how Cedar Falls itself handled all of this, because small towns process this kind of story in their own particular way, and I think it's worth describing honestly, both the parts that were kind and the parts that weren't. Cedar Falls is not a large town, roughly 11,000 people, the kind of place where the woman who cuts your hair also cuts your neighbour's hair, and hears things in between appointments that end up circulating with a speed that would embarrass a wire service. Within about 6 weeks of the divorce filing becoming a matter of public record, which it inevitably does in a county courthouse small enough that the clerks know most of the names that come through, I understood that a version of this story, sometimes reasonably accurate and sometimes wildly distorted, was making its way through the specific channels small towns use: the beauty salon, the church coffee hour, the sidelines at Miles's basketball games. Most of what I encountered directly was kind, or at least neutral, and I want to give the town credit for that, because I think it would have been very easy for people to make this uglier than it needed to be. Ava's swim coach, a no-nonsense woman named Coach Prentice, pulled me aside at a meet about 2 months in and said simply, "I don't know the details and I don't need to, but I've watched you show up to every single one of Ava's meets since this started. Same seat, same water bottle, same intensity cheering her on. And that's the only part of this story that's any of my business. So that's the only part I'm going to have an opinion about." A few people were less generous, inevitably. A mother at Miles's basketball games, who I overheard, not quite quietly enough, telling another parent a version of events that had somehow transformed me into the unreasonable party who'd refused counselling and forced the divorce, a version so far from what had actually happened that I initially wanted to correct it and then decided, following the same discipline that had gotten me through everything else, that correcting every distorted rumour in a small town is a losing game that costs you more dignity than it returns, and that the people whose good opinion actually mattered to me, Paul, Frank Delgado, Coach Prentice, Karen, my own children, already had the accurate version, and that would have to be enough. I want to describe the first anniversary of the day I found the phone, because I marked it privately, without telling anyone except Paul, and I think the specific way I chose to mark it says something about where I had actually arrived by then. I did not spend that Saturday in October doing anything dramatic or symbolic. I drove Ava to a swim meet in the morning, spent the afternoon helping Miles build an elaborate Lego set he'd been saving up for months to buy, and in the evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the garage, alone, in the same folding chair for about 20 minutes, not because I needed to relive anything specific, but because I wanted to notice, deliberately, what had changed in that space over the preceding year. The paint cans were still on the same shelf, minus the one I'd eventually thrown away along with the phone itself, once Denise confirmed she had extracted everything useful from it, and it no longer served any evidentiary purpose. The garage smelled the same, faintly of sawdust and old paint, but I noticed, sitting there, that the specific cold, hollow feeling I associated with that space for months after the discovery had genuinely faded into something closer to ordinary, ambient memory, painful in the way an old injury is painful when you press directly on the scar, but no longer the raw, all-consuming wound it had been for that first difficult stretch. I sat with that realization for a while, and then I went back inside and made myself a cup of tea and went to bed at a completely ordinary hour, which felt, in its own quiet way, like the actual unglamorous marker of having survived something, not a dramatic ceremony. Just an ordinary Tuesday-shaped Saturday that no longer had the power to take my whole evening hostage. Claire and I settled, over that same first year, into a working co-parenting rhythm that I want to describe honestly, because I think it matters to anyone listening who is worried that a story like this one has to end in permanent, bitter estrangement between the two people who share children. It did not end that way for us, though I want to be clear that this took real, deliberate effort on both our parts, not some natural evolution that happened on its own. We settled into a pattern of a single coordinating phone call every Sunday evening, 15 minutes, strictly logistics, school events, medical appointments, schedule swaps, and we both, by unspoken mutual agreement, kept those calls entirely free of anything relating to the marriage itself, a discipline that took real effort in the early months when old grievances would occasionally surface uninvited, and that became, gradually, genuinely easy by around month 9. The specific kind of easy that comes from two people who have decided, independently but in parallel, that their children's stability matters more than either person's residual anger. Claire attended every one of Miles's basketball games that season, sitting several rows from me without any visible tension either of us needed to manage, and she came to Ava's regional swim championship in the spring, and when Ava placed second in the 200 butterfly, both of us stood up cheering at the same moment, several feet apart, and caught each other's eye afterward in a look that contained, as far as I could tell, nothing except two parents genuinely simultaneously proud of the same child. No residual anger visible in it at all in that specific instant. Whatever complicated feelings existed underneath it the rest of the time, I want to be honest that arriving at that specific functional co-parenting piece took real work, several uncomfortable conversations, at least one occasion where I had to remind myself, out loud in my own truck, that punishing Claire through the children was not a form of justice I was willing to practice, no matter how satisfying it might have felt in a bad moment. And I think that ongoing, daily discipline, more than the 5 weeks of investigation that made the headlines of this story in my own mind, is actually the harder, longer version of the same skill, patience applied not to building a case, but to building an ordinary, sustainable life for two kids who did not choose any part of what happened to their family. I want to spend some time now telling you about a question I have been asked, in one form or another, by nearly everyone I've eventually told the full story to, from Dr. Say to Paul to, eventually Colleen, and it's a question I think deserves a more complete answer than I usually give in the moment, because the honest answer is more complicated than any single sentence can hold. The question is always some version of, do you regret waiting 5 weeks? Wouldn't it have been easier or kinder or more honest to confront Claire the moment you found that phone in the paint can, rather than building an entire case file while continuing to eat dinner across from her every night? I have thought about this question more than almost any other single aspect of the whole ordeal, and I want to walk through my honest answer completely, because I think it matters to anyone listening who might find themselves, at some point standing in their own version of that garage, the immediate visceral confrontation, the version where I had thrown the phone down on the table the same night I found it and demanded an explanation, would have felt, in that first hour, considerably more honest in a certain emotional sense. A raw, unfiltered reaction matching a raw, unfiltered discovery. But I do not believe it would have actually served the truth better, and I think this distinction matters enormously. An immediate confrontation, built on 40 seconds of 2 lock-screen previews and a hidden phone, would have given Claire the opportunity, whether consciously calculated or simply out of natural human self-preservation, to construct a partial explanation in the moment to minimise what I'd seen, to buy time to coordinate a story with Derek before I had gathered any independent verification at all. I would have been negotiating from a position of partial information against someone with every incentive, in that first panicked hour, to make the partial information look smaller than it actually was. The 5 weeks did not delay the truth. The 5 weeks were the only reason I ever got the complete truth at all, rather than whatever smaller, more manageable version of it Claire might have been able to construct on the spot. I also want to address something Dr. Osi raised with me directly in one of our sessions that I think is worth including honestly, because it complicates the narrative in a way I believe matters. He asked me, gently, whether any part of the 5 weeks had been about something other than gathering evidence, whether some part of me had also been, consciously or not, building a kind of emotional armour for myself, so that by the time I actually said the words out loud to Claire, I'd already grieved most of the loss privately and alone, and therefore did not have to fully feel the rawest version of that grief in front of her. I sat with that question for a long time before answering, and I told him, honestly, that I believed there was truth in it, that the discipline I brought to the investigation was real and professionally rooted, but that it had also, quietly, functioned as a kind of protection, allowing me to arrive at that anniversary dinner already partially numb to a blow I would otherwise have had to absorb in real time, in front of her, without any of the preparation the 5 weeks had given me. I do not think that makes the choice to wait the wrong choice. I think it means the choice served 2 purposes at once, one strategic and one deeply personal, and I have made peace with both of those purposes being true simultaneously, the same way I've made peace with Claire being capable of genuine love and genuine deception running on parallel tracks inside the same 14 months. I want to tell you, too, about the specific moment I stopped thinking of the entire ordeal, primarily as something that happened to me, and started thinking of it as something I got through, because I think that shift matters to anyone listening who is currently still in the middle of their own version of this, still in the investigation phase, still eating dinner across from someone while building a spreadsheet in secret. It happened, for me, on a Tuesday evening about 15 months after the divorce, an entirely unremarkable evening, helping Miles with a fraction homework problem at the kitchen table, while Ava studied for a biology test in the next room, the specific ordinary domestic noise of a functioning household filling the space where, for a long stretch, only a heavy, watchful silence had lived. I looked up at some point mid-explanation of common denominators and realised I had gone almost 2 full weeks without thinking about the paint can, or the folder in my truck console, or the specific sound Claire's voice had made confirming the August date at that anniversary dinner. It was not a dramatic realisation. It arrived quietly, the way most real healing arrives, not as a single triumphant morning, but as an accumulating series of ordinary Tuesdays where the old wound simply took up less and less room, until one day you look up from a fraction problem and notice, almost by accident, that it isn't occupying the centre of your attention anymore. I want to describe a specific change I made to the house itself, about 1.5 years after the divorce, because I think it captures something about how a person eventually reclaims a physical space that has been carrying too much weight. I renovated the garage, finally, something Claire and I had talked about doing for years and never quite gotten around to. New shelving, a proper workbench, a small space heater, so I could actually use it comfortably in the winter instead of just enduring it. I want to be honest that part of my motivation was genuinely practical. The old shelving had been sagging for years and I'd simply never prioritised fixing it, but part of it, and I only fully admitted this to myself after the work was done, was that I wanted to change the specific physical geometry of the space where I had once stood holding a paint can that turned out to weigh more than it should have. The shelf where that can had sat no longer exists in its old form. The paint cans themselves went to a hazardous waste collection day at the county fairgrounds, and I remember standing in that renovated garage the first time, new shelving installed, workbench organised the way I'd always wanted it, and feeling something I can only describe as a quiet, unglamorous reclamation not of my marriage, which I had no interest in reclaiming, but of a room in my own house that I'd allowed one afternoon in October to define for far too long. Frank Delgado offered me a promotion about 2 years after the divorce, a regional director position overseeing 3 warehouse locations instead of 1, a role that would have meant considerably more travel and considerably more income, and I want to describe the specific way I thought through that decision, because I think it reflects how much the entire ordeal had changed my priorities in ways I did not fully anticipate. I turned it down, at least in that specific form, and told Frank honestly that I needed a role that kept me local and predictable, while Ava and Miles were still in the house, that the version of stability I had fought so hard to give them over the preceding 2 years was not something I was willing to trade for a bigger title, and Frank, to his credit, did not push, and instead restructured a smaller regional coordination role for me that gave me a meaningful raise without the travel increase, telling me, with the same bluntness he had shown throughout the whole ordeal, that a company smart enough to keep good people finds a way to fit the job around the person's actual life, instead of demanding the person's life bend around the job, and I have stayed in that role since, genuinely satisfied with it in a way that surprised me, having spent most of my 20s and 30s assuming bigger titles was simply what ambition was supposed to look like. I want to tell you about a conversation with Ava, about 2 years after the divorce, because I think it's the conversation that best captures where our family eventually landed. She was 16 by then, considering colleges, increasingly independent in the specific way 16-year-olds start pulling away from a household in preparation for eventually leaving it. And one evening, driving home from a swim meet in a comfortable silence, she said, "Out of nowhere, Dad. I used to think what happened to you and Mom meant something was wrong with marriage in general, like the whole idea of it was maybe just fragile and fake underneath." And then she paused and said, "But watching you and Mom actually figure out how to still be good parents together, even after everything, I think I actually believe in it more now, not less. Just a different version of it than I thought I was supposed to believe in." I want to be honest that I had to pull over for a moment after she said that, not because I was upset, but because it was, without question, one of the proudest moments of my entire life as a father, hearing my daughter articulate in her own words the exact thing I had hoped, without ever being able to guarantee might eventually be true, that the way her parents handled the aftermath of a terrible thing could end up teaching her something more valuable than if the terrible thing had never happened at all. Though I want to be clear, I would still have traded that lesson in a heartbeat to have never needed to teach it. I want to close this part of the story by telling you honestly about my relationship with Colleen as it stands now, roughly 2.5 years after that grey October Saturday, because I think people deserve to know that this story does eventually arrive somewhere good, even if it takes considerably longer to get there than the dramatic version of these stories sometimes suggests. Colleen and I got engaged this past spring, a quiet proposal on the same walking bridge over Miller Creek, where I had once proposed to Claire, a choice I discussed with Colleen beforehand rather than springing on her as some kind of secret symbolism, because I wanted her to understand exactly why that specific bridge mattered to me and to make sure she was comfortable with what it represented before I asked her there, and she told me, when I explained it, that she understood completely, that a good bridge doesn't stop being a good bridge just because one crossing on it didn't lead where you expected, and I have thought about that specific sentence more than almost anything else she has ever said to me, because I think it captures something true about the entire arc of this story better than I could have articulated it myself. I am telling you all of this now, in as complete a form as I can manage, from a distance of exactly 2.5 years, and I want to spend some final time walking back through the whole arc of it, because I think there are specific lessons inside the story that matter more than the dramatic shape of the discovery itself, and I want to make sure I've said them clearly rather than leaving them buried inside the narrative for you to extract on your own. The first lesson is about the value of the pause, the 5 weeks I spent building a case instead of reacting in the first hour, and I want to be precise about why I believe this matters so much, because I know some listeners will hear this and think it sounds cold or overly calculated, the language of a man treating his marriage like a warehouse audit rather than a human relationship. I understand that reaction, and I want to address it directly rather than pretending it doesn't apply. The discipline was not coldness. It was, if anything, the opposite, a refusal to let the worst, most wounded version of myself make a decision that would define the rest of my children's childhoods, my own financial security, and the actual, complete truth of what had happened to 16 years of my life. A wounded man acting in the first hour is not a more honest man, he is simply a faster one, and speed is not the same thing as integrity. If you find yourself, at any point, standing in your own version of that garage, holding your own version of that paint can, I want you to hear this clearly. You're allowed to take the time you need to understand the complete shape of what you're looking at before you say a single word out loud. That time is not a betrayal of your own pain. It is the only way to make sure whatever you eventually do with that pain is built on something solid enough to hold your entire future. The second lesson is about the specific, complicated nature of the people who betray us, because I think the easy version of this story, the version that gets told in a single dramatic sentence, paints Claire as simply a villain, a woman who lied for 14 months for no reason beyond selfishness or cruelty. I do not believe that version is accurate, and I think believing it would have made my own healing considerably harder rather than easier. Claire loved our children completely, before, during, and after everything that happened. Claire was, in most other observable respects, an honest, hard-working, genuinely kind person, and I do not say that to excuse what she did. I say it because I think the harder, more useful truth is that ordinary people, people who are not monsters, people who love their families and work hard and tell the truth about nearly everything in their lives, are nonetheless capable, under specific conditions of loneliness or flattery or simple accumulated momentum, of building an entire second architecture of deception that coexists alongside everything genuine and good about them. Understanding that complexity did not make me forgive what happened. It made me able to walk away from it without needing to carry a simplified, cartoonish version of hatred that I suspect would have poisoned considerably more of my life than the actual betrayal did on its own. The third lesson, and I think this is the one I would want any listener currently living inside their own version of this story to hear most clearly, is about the specific, practical value of building a complete file before you act, not out of some abstract love of paperwork, but because the version of yourself who walks away from a discovery like this with dignity, with your children's stability protected, with your financial future intact, with the actual, complete truth in your hands rather than a partial, negotiated version of it, is the version who did the patient, unglamorous work first. I think about Miriam's sentence often, that most men who sit in that chair already know the answer before they hire an investigator. What they're actually paying for is a version of the truth solid enough to survive someone else arguing with it later. I would extend that beyond hiring an investigator specifically. Whatever form your own version of building the file takes, slow, careful, methodical fact-gathering, before a single accusation leaves your mouth, I believe it is very nearly always worth the discomfort of the waiting, because the alternative, acting on the first raw wave of a partial discovery, tends to cost people considerably more than the extra weeks would have. I want to tell you finally about where things stand today, on the day I am recording this, because I think endings matter, even imperfect ongoing ones like mine. Ava is a senior now, has committed to swim at a state university 2 hours from here, close enough to come home on weekends, far enough to build the independent life she's clearly ready for. Miles is 13, has moved on from basketball cards to an equally intense obsession with a video game design club at school, and still, more nights than not, wants me to sit with him for 20 minutes before bed just to talk about nothing in particular, a habit I hope he never entirely outgrows. Claire and I spoke last week, our regular Sunday call, 15 minutes of school logistics and an upcoming dentist appointment, and it was, as it has been for over a year now, entirely ordinary, entirely businesslike, entirely free of the specific charge that conversation used to carry in the earlier months. Colleen and I are getting married next June, a small ceremony, close family only, and Ava has already asked to be there in the wedding party, which undid me considerably more than I expected it to when she asked. I still keep a folded copy of Denise's original surveillance report in a drawer in my desk, not because I need to look at it, I haven't opened that specific folder in well over a year, but because I think there is something important about not pretending the whole ordeal didn't happen, about keeping a physical, concrete reminder that the calm, steady man sitting here telling you this story 2.5 years later is the same man who once stood in a cold garage at midnight reading 2 lock screen messages over and over, trying to breathe normally enough to walk back into his own kitchen. I do not think you become a stronger version of yourself by forgetting what broke you. I think you become a stronger version of yourself by remembering it accurately, completely, without either exaggerating the damage or pretending it was smaller than it actually was, and by choosing deliberately over and over in 1,000 small ordinary Tuesdays to build something steadier on the other side of it. If any part of this story sounds like the shape of something you are currently living through, whether you are standing at the very beginning of it, holding your own version of a folded receipt or a hidden phone, or somewhere in the middle of the long, lonely work of building your own file before you say a single word out loud, I want you to know that the waiting is not weakness, and the calm is not coldness. And whatever you eventually decide to do with the truth once you have all of it, you deserve to make that decision from a position of complete, verified clarity, rather than from the first raw hour of a wound still bleeding. That clarity is worth every difficult week it costs you to build it. I promise you it is. Thank you for listening to my story all the way through. If it meant something to you, if any part of it helped you feel less alone in whatever you're carrying right now, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because we share stories exactly like this one. Real, honest, first-person accounts of the hardest chapters in people's lives every single day. And there is a whole community of people in the comments below who have lived through some version of what I just told you, who show up for each other in ways that have meant more to me than I expected when I first started sharing this. If you have your own story you'd like to tell, or if you simply want to talk about what you just heard, leave a comment. I read every single one, and so does this community. And if you know someone who needs to hear tonight specifically that the patient, careful path through a betrayal is always worth more than the fast one, please consider sharing this with them. I want to leave you with one last thought before I go, because I think it is the truest single sentence I have arrived at in 2.5 years of turning this entire story over in my mind, on porches, in therapy sessions, at kitchen tables, in a renovated garage that no longer holds the same weight it once did. The worst thing that ever happened to me did not actually happen in that garage on that grey October Saturday. The worst thing that could have happened to me would have been letting that discovery turn me into a man who could no longer trust his own judgment, who could no longer sit calmly with his children over dinner, who could no longer eventually let another good person like Colleen close enough to matter, out of a permanent, understandable but ultimately corrosive fear that every kindness is secretly hiding a paint can of its own. I did not let that happen. Not because I'm unusually strong, but because I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work of building an honest, complete picture of what actually happened, facing every uncomfortable piece of it directly, and then, deliberately, choosing what kind of man I wanted to be on the other side of it. That choice is available to anyone listening to this story right now, no matter how early or how late you are in your own version of it, and I hope, genuinely, that you make it. The same way I hope, whatever specific shape your own paint can, or your own folded receipt or your own hidden app takes, that you give yourself the same patient, careful runway I eventually gave myself, because you are worth that much time, and so is the truth, whatever it eventually turns out to be, and so, in the end, is the calm, steady, patient version of yourself waiting quietly on the other side of all of it, ready to be found the same way I finally found mine, one patient week at a time, one honest fact at a time, until the whole picture was finally, completely yours to hold. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next story.